The story begins on the continent of Mahidoro, 4 years after Emperor Cardion ascended the throne of the Eshrashar Empire and began conquering neighboring kingdoms. Caught in the vortex of this war, there was a mercenary, who was trying to hide his own past. However, the real story begins years earlier, revealing a young man completely shocked to suddenly hear that he was going to get married. The boy asks for explanations, and his father, calmly seated at the table, reveals that the chosen bride is the daughter of Baron Wibben. The patriarch tries to convince his son, describing the 16-year-old girl as a beautiful and quiet young woman whose only hobby was gardening. The boy listens to everything in silence, simply holding the doorknob. Outside the office, he tries to absorb his father's words, assuring him that it would be a good marriage, realizing that at 14, his destiny was already set. The young man is astonished to discover that he is engaged to a noblewoman whose face he doesn't even know. Still processing the news, he takes a step back, shocked by the sudden imposition. Some time later, already at the ceremony venue, he observes the architecture of the hall, reflecting that he still couldn't understand any of his father's words. He kept wondering why such a distinguished noblewoman would accept the union. He tries to understand why someone from high society would marry the heir of a family of ordinary merchants. At that moment, the bride politely approaches and greets him at the altar. The boy blushed instantly, becoming completely mesmerized by her presence. The young woman formally introduces herself as Tyria Wibben, revealing all her beauty in a long white dress. The boy is enchanted, comparing the bride's golden hair to fields of wheat and her green eyes to the fresh buds of spring. He also notices the young woman's pale skin and perfectly red lips. In his mind, he concludes that Tyria is the very definition of a mysterious and elegant woman. Would you make that deal? The boy's father has to intervene, touching his shoulder and asking Elric to finally introduce himself. Elric snaps out of his trance and stammers a greeting, while Tyria says she's looking forward to the life they'll have together. The young man's mind becomes a complete mess when faced with the grandeur of the moment. However, as they stand side by side at the altar, only one thought cuts through the chaos in his head: the realization that he would spend the rest of his life with that person. Looking at the serene expression on the bride's face as she held the bouquet, Elric perfectly understood what she was feeling. He tries his best to hide the silly smile that appears on his face, realizing at the moment of exchanging rings that this was his first love. The young man even has to force a serious expression to avoid laughing with pure joy as he places the ring on her finger. Elric merely observes his bride, completely oblivious to what was really happening behind the scenes. He had no idea of the young woman's hesitant look, nor that this arranged marriage might be hurting her deeply. Later, a severe storm rages outside the mansion during the night. The rainy weather contrasts with the solitary light of a candle burning in one of the rooms. Elric nervously fiddles with his wedding ring, still reflecting on how sudden the whole arrangement was. With a passionate smile, he could hardly believe that such a worthy woman was now officially his wife. And I can't believe you still haven't subscribed to the channel yet. He remembers his father's words when he announced that the bride would be the Baron's daughter. Genuine joy fills the boy's face for a moment. However, reality suddenly hits him, and he realizes that the situation made absolutely no sense. Annoyed, he seeks out a maid at the mansion and questions the real reason why a noblewoman like Tyria would agree to marry him. The woman hesitates, clearly uncomfortable with the question, and tries to change the subject. Elric doesn't give up and begs Rhonda to tell the truth, because he knows she's hiding something important. The maid sighs heavily, unsure how to break the news to the young master. Finally, she reveals the harsh reality about arranged marriages, leaving the boy shocked. Rhonda explains that the once wealthy and famous barony of Wibben was now mired in debt and lacked the funds even to survive. Elric's father took advantage of the family's vulnerability and demanded the marriage in exchange for paying off all debts and providing financial support. The maid adds that, through this purchased union, the Portman merchant family would finally be elevated to nobility. The weight of the revelation hangs in the air as Rhonda lowers her head, making it clear that the girl had essentially been sold to them. Elric is horrified by the discovery and refuses to believe his own father's cruel actions. Desperate, he panics at the thought of the humiliation his fiancée was going through. Without a second thought, he abruptly opens the door and leaves the room amidst the frightened calls of the maid. Elric's hurried footsteps echoed through the mansion's corridors as he ran in search of his wife. All the young man wants at that moment is to reach Tyria and apologize for what his family had done. He runs, internally begging to find any excuse that could comfort her. After running desperately through the mansion, Elric finally reaches his fiancée's bedroom door, breathless. He leans against the wall of the dark hallway, trying to catch his breath before going inside. The young man's heart races as he takes a deep breath, absorbing the gravity of the situation. As soon as he recovers, he reaches for the doorknob to face the young woman. However, his movement stops abruptly upon hearing a faint muffled noise coming from inside the room. Peeking through the small crack in the half-open door, he notices that someone was sobbing. Inside, Tyria sheds silent tears down her face. The noblewoman lay huddled on the cold floor, hugging her knees in a state of utter sorrow. Elric's heart sinks as he witnesses his wife's suffering, finally understanding the weight of that arranged marriage. Shocked by the desolate scene, he takes a slow step back. At that exact moment, the boy swore to himself that he would do everything to annul the union. Far away, Elric's father continued peacefully taking care of the family paperwork. The patriarch sat in his silent office, lit only by a candle. Suddenly, the tranquility of the place is broken by Elric, who throws the door open, shouting for the man. Without any hesitation, the young man demands that the wedding be cancelled immediately. Irritated, he questions whether Tyria had accepted the offer only to save her own family, realizing that she had literally been bought. The boy even begs aloud for his father to undo that cruelty. The older man is unfazed by the despair and simply calls out his son's name in a warning tone. With a frightening expression on his face, the patriarch orders the boy to stop acting like a spoiled child. He rises, imposing his presence, and declares that they are now nobles, demanding that the heir behave accordingly. The icy, bloodshot gaze of the family leader hits the boy like a blow. Elric clenches his fists tightly, forced to face his harsh reality once more. He remembers the enduring stigma of being the child who killed his own mother on the day he was born. The young man finally understands that he was merely a target for his father's resentment and a simple political tool. For its creator, it was nothing more than a necessary stepping stone to achieve the prosperity of the Portman family. Realizing that this was his only use in the house awakens a new determination in Elric's eyes. He turns his back and walks towards the office exit, deciding that his only option was to disappear from that place. The boy takes this drastic action both to free the sold bride and to ruin his father's grand plans at once. He decides to drop the Portman surname forever. Outside the property, the nighttime storm continues to batter the wheat fields. Elric stealthily flees in the heavy rain, carrying only a sword and a small travel bag. During the solitary walk, he still tries to understand what was really going through Tyria's mind as she cried in her room. The young man wondered if her pain stemmed from being sold, from the sadness of abandoning her family, or if she simply hated him. Stopping in the middle of the dirt road, he looks back with a melancholy expression on his tear-soaked face. But he quickly pushes those thoughts away and resumes walking, muttering that he was leaving anyway. Time passes inexorably, and the story moves towards the imposing gates of a military fortress under the same rainy weather. A veteran, muscular warrior notices someone approaching and asks who was out in the rain. Judging by the visitor's clothes and posture, the older man quickly deduces that the young man had come to become a mercenary. With a sharp gaze and far more mature than before, the newcomer confirms the guard's suspicion. The young man brandishes his weapon and officially introduces himself, using his new name, Kasha. In the 10 years that followed, Kasha completely abandoned his life of nobility and lived among corpses on the battlefields. Swinging his sword fiercely in search of a place to rest, he ended up earning the fearsome reputation of a sword demon, keeping his past a complete secret. Facing entire armies, he roamed countless conflict zones across the continent. The naive boy who ran away from home has completely disappeared, giving way to a war-hardened fighter in heavy armor. Under the orange light of dusk, his red eyes carry the coldness of someone accustomed to death. Back to the current situation on the battlefield, enemy troops line up their shields, spears, and rifles toward the lone warrior. Without showing any sign of fear, Kasha waits in the middle of the encirclement as the battalion advances with a war cry. In a precise instant, he grips the hilt of his long sword firmly. The mercenary makes a swift movement and unleashes a devastating crimson-tinged slash against the enemy lines. With his face stained with the blood of his enemies, Kasha continues the carnage with a serene yet merciless gaze. The scene changes to a bustling tavern, full of customers chatting and drinking. The sound of the doorbell catches the attention of the counter employee. The man welcomes the newly arrived customer who leans firmly on a cane. It's Elric, who now walks with a limp and a tired expression. The warrior drags his leg across the hall, drawing the curious glances of everyone present. Some customers begin whispering amongst themselves, recognizing him as the sword demon and wondering what he's doing away from the battlefields. Others notice his leg and speculate whether the fearsome mercenary had been wounded in combat. When the young man approaches the counter, the clerk can't hide his surprise and asks what on earth happened to make him limp like that. Elric simply brushes it off, saying it's a common wartime injury while casually flipping through a newspaper. Reading the news, he remarks to himself that he will probably have to live that way for quite some time. Suddenly, the warrior violently crumples the sheet of paper. The attendant notices the abrupt reaction and calls him over with concern. Without taking his eyes off the page, Elric remains silent while the employee asks if there's anything wrong. The reason for the shock was the photo of his own father printed on the sheet. The shrill sound of a train whistle cuts through the late-afternoon landscape. A steam train travels along the tracks through the mountains at sunset. Inside the train car, Elric observes the landscape through the window with his cane resting against the side. He reflects on the irony of finding the face of the man he so hated printed in a small obituary in the corner of the newspaper. That was the announcement of his father's death, Hovin Portman. The news reminds the boy of the night he ran away from home in the heavy rain. He recalls that at 14 he still held on to the childlike hope that his father would come looking for him. On reflection, he concludes that belief was not entirely unfounded. Ultimately, even though he was being treated merely as a tool to restore the family's honor, and knowing that the man was guilty of his mother's death, something kept him there. Deep down, he felt that, regardless of everything, he was still his son. Alone in the train car, the mercenary lowers his head, frustrated at having desperately wanted even a drop of affection from that man. As the train crosses the dark night, he accepts that it was all just an illusion and that the object of his resentment no longer existed. All that remained was a cowardly version of himself, who used the patriarch's death as an excuse to finally return home. The sound of the train's brakes awakens him from his empty thoughts and regrets, announcing his arrival in his hometown after 10 years. The vehicle parks at the imposing Wibbin station. Outside, the breeze rustles the vast wheat fields under the orange sky. Elric contemplates the landscape he left behind in his childhood. Walking slowly along the dirt road, he realizes that absolutely nothing has changed during the entire decade he's been away. He continues his journey through quiet and peaceful streets, now tinged with the red of autumn leaves. Watching the villagers strolling leisurely, the warrior senses that this place is both familiar and completely foreign. The atmosphere lacks any of the sharp tension of the battlefields, and children run around smiling and playing nearby. The sound of the cane stops echoing when he pauses in his steps. The boy gives a slight smile, captivated by the peace of the countryside. He gazes at the wheat fields with nostalgia, noting that the great symbol of the Wibbin territory remains unchanged. The scene reminds him of when he was just a child playing hide-and-seek with the boys in the village. He also recalls the amusing scoldings he received from the maid for ruining his clothes in the dirt. With each step through the plantation, memories of the past become ever more vivid in his mind. Immersed in these memories, he sighs softly. Suddenly, it stops halfway. Her relaxed gaze gives way to a serious and attentive expression. His thoughts immediately turn to Tyria, and he begins to wonder if the young woman is still all right. He tries to convince himself that yes, assuming that such a beautiful woman must have already been courted and married someone else. At that moment, he notices a delicate hand lightly touching the ears of wheat just ahead. At that same instant, a cry calling for Tyria makes Elric's eyes widen in shock. He turns around and sees a desperate maid scolding a beautiful blonde woman for carrying too much weight alone. The young woman in the straw hat nervously tries to calm the situation, leaving the mercenary completely paralyzed as he realizes that his first love is right there in front of him. Elric can hardly believe what he sees and wonders to himself if that woman was really Tyria. The young maid runs to the lady of the house, calling out to her with concern because she is carrying sheaves of wheat. The mercenary watches his wife from afar, confused by her presence there. He wonders why the noblewoman was still working in those fields under the setting sun. In his mind, the cruel doubt arises as to the real reason she remained on the property after so long. The answer to that question hits Elric with painful clarity. He realizes that the young woman had remained in that place simply because she was his wife, and bound by the marriage. The boy lowers his gaze, feeling like a complete fool for not having thought about the consequences of his actions. Elric recognizes how naive he was to believe that the union would be magically undone simply because he had disappeared. He understands that if the marriage could be dissolved so easily, her family wouldn't have sold her in the first place. The weight of guilt hits him when he realizes that his impulsive actions in his youth ended up robbing Tyria of the last fragment of freedom she had left. In the end, her great rebellious escape only left her a prisoner on the property. Elric laments not having been able to protect even his own pride, much less the woman he married. Walking slowly towards her, he considers himself a selfish and cowardly man. He reflects that, during all the years he spent wielding a sword and shedding blood on the battlefields, his wife was neglected. His heart aches when he imagines how lonely and difficult the young woman's life must have been, living in the mansion without any support. Standing in the middle of the dirt road, the warrior decides he needs to apologize to her urgently. However, he hesitates, feeling that he doesn't even have the right to do so, and fearing that Tyria will reject his lamentations. Gathering his courage, Elric attempts to communicate with his wife, stammering nervously. The young woman stares at him in absolute silence, without showing any apparent emotion in her eyes. Ignoring the young man's failed attempts, the noblewoman turns her back and tells the maid that they should return home. Elric watches his wife walk away silently across the illuminated field. Tyria's rejection leaves the mercenary completely devastated. The boy clenched his teeth in anguish, wishing that, at the very least, she had yelled and gotten angry with him. Elric's troubled mind conjures up a grim scenario, imagining Tyria with a sinister smile, having been abandoned. He surmises that his wife would be wondering what a traitor like him hoped to achieve by returning after so long. Suddenly, the warrior is jolted from his self-deprecating thoughts with a start. His red eyes widened in pure surprise. A few steps away, the young woman had stopped walking and turned towards him. Tyria glances over her shoulder and calmly asks if her husband wouldn't be accompanying them. The wife's receptive attitude leaves the young man shocked and speechless. Planting his cane firmly on the ground, Elric promptly says he's coming and begins to follow them along the wheat path. The group finally arrives at the gates of the imposing Portman mansion, and the young maid asks them to wait while she goes to call the butler. Tyria waits patiently on the entrance steps, still firmly holding her sheaf of wheat. The young man approaches the door of his old house, standing side by side with his wife. He silently examines the facade of the enormous building. The warrior is amazed to see that the place remained exactly the same and can hardly believe that 10 years had passed. Everything was perfectly preserved as it had been in the past, from the grand fountain to the details of the walls. He realizes he can vividly remember every corner of the property, from the number of windows to the location of every stain. A slight, nostalgic smile appears on the young master's face. At that moment, a woman wearing glasses comes out of the house and asks the mysterious visitor who he is. Elric immediately recognizes her and lets out a small sigh of delight. The housekeeper stopped at the door, demanding to know who that man with the cane had come to see. The boy smiles broadly and enthusiastically calls her by the name Rhonda. In his mind, he fondly notes that the employee hadn't changed at all in that decade. Maintaining his gentle smile, Elric asks if she no longer recognizes him. Rhonda frowned, still confused by the stranger's familiarity. Suddenly, the housekeeper's eyes widened as she noticed the young man's features. Shocked, she stammers, calling him young master, while Elric continues to smile. Rhonda runs to him, overcome with emotion, and grabs the young man's arm, asking almost in tears if it was truly young Master Elric who had returned. Elric hugs Rhonda affectionately, smiling as he says it had been a long time, and he was finally back. The governess couldn't contain her emotion and let the tears fall, relieved to see that it really was her young master. While the two talk in the wheat fields, she confesses that she almost didn't recognize him because he had changed so much. The boy gives a gentle smile, agreeing that her appearance was quite different and that it was natural for her to be confused. Suddenly, the mercenary's eyes widen as he notices a crucial detail. He remembers Tyria's words, saying that she was still there because she was his wife. Feeling guilty for having spent 10 years fighting and then abandoning her, Elric abruptly turns his face away to hide his embarrassment, leaving Rhonda confused. The housekeeper notices the sudden change in his behavior and asks if something is wrong with him. The young master merely reflects that if even the woman who cared for him like a mother couldn't recognize him at first, something didn't make sense. He turned his gaze to Tyria, who remained standing there in silence. Completely sweaty and bewildered, the boy tries to process the situation. He wonders to himself how his wife managed to recognize him with just a single glance after an entire decade. The scene cuts to the interior of the mansion, with the curtains of one of the bedrooms swaying gently in the light of dusk. Tyria is leaning against the window, silently observing the outside. The young woman stares intently at Elric and Rhonda, talking near the fields. She remembers the exact moment the boy looked away, embarrassed, just minutes before. Suddenly, the noblewoman takes a step back and puts her hand to her chest, looking stunned. With a flushed face and short breath, she tries to regain her composure in the face of her own feelings. In his mind, a clear memory of the scar on the back of Elric's neck emerges. She also remembers the boy's brown hair and reddish eyes. Contrary to what everyone thought, Tyria felt that absolutely nothing about him had changed. Later, night falls, and Elric takes a relaxing bath in a large bathtub in the mansion. Enjoying the hot water, the warrior remains puzzled, trying to understand how his wife identified him so quickly. Still lost in thought, he finally gets out of the bathtub, dripping water onto the floor. The boy puts on a white robe and ties the sash around his waist, preparing to rest. However, he gets a big fright when he notices something in front of him. As he leaves, he comes face to face with Tyria, covered only by a small towel, walking towards him. The young woman froze, blushing violently at the sight of her husband there. Panicked, she shrinks back, hugging the towel, and desperately apologizes. Tears of shame begin to well up in the noblewoman's eyes, while Elric tries to reassure her, saying that everything is all right. Tyria tries to walk away crying, but the warrior rushes forward, begging her not to be like that. In an impulsive gesture, he gently cups his wife's face to comfort her. At that very moment, young Marie lets out a shrill scream of fright as she drops her laundry basket. The maid runs hurriedly down the hallway. She arrives screaming, asking her mistress what was happening there. The employee freezes when she catches Elric holding Tyria, who is almost naked. The two remain completely frozen in the same position, appearing to have been caught in a very compromising situation. Extremely embarrassed, Tyria whispers the maid's name, her eyes filled with tears. Elric tries to disguise the disastrous scene with a forced smile, inventing the flimsy excuse that his wife had almost fallen and he caught her. Abruptly cutting off the comedic tone, the story takes us back to the past, to the rainy defense lines of the Chevor border. One of the guards from the 5th Regiment observes the fog with a tense look, preparing for combat. Before them stands LeBron, the feared cavalryman of the Imperial Army's vanguard, displaying a sadistic grin. Without retreating, Chevor's soldiers advance with shields and swords raised, shouting to kill the invader. LeBron is not intimidated and laughs maniacally, warning that he would cut them all into pieces. The knight fulfills his promise and carries out a brutal massacre, hurling the bloodied bodies of the guards into the air with a single blow. The surviving soldiers fall into utter despair, realizing they don't stand a chance against that monster. The commander orders an immediate retreat, and the men flee, running back behind the defensive line. However, while the entire army retreats in terror, a single man calmly walks in the opposite direction with his sword slung over his shoulder. LeBron stops his advance and faces the isolated individual, wondering if he was just another useless mercenary hired by Chevor. Oblivious to the enemy's insults, Elric, still living under the name Keisha, assumes his fighting stance in the middle of the rainy battlefield. Maintaining his composure in the midst of the battlefield, Elric turns his face away and waits for the right moment in the rain. LeBron charges forward like a maniac, brandishing his sword against the lone target. Without flinching an inch, the mercenary intercepts the Imperial Knight's blow with his heavy blade. He firmly withstands the onslaught and remains unfazed by the enemy's strength. In a fluid and brutal movement, Elric counterattacks, tearing off LeBron's helmet and spilling his opponent's blood. The mighty Imperial warrior falls to his knees on the muddy ground, completely subdued by the mercenary. Without giving anyone a chance to react, the boy performs one last swift attack. The knight's decapitated head rolls across the damp earth, coming to rest right in front of the Imperial troops. The soldiers' eyes widened, and they began to sweat profusely at the bizarre scene. Standing imposingly behind LeBron's body, the mercenary officially introduces himself as Kasha, a knight in the service of Chevor. He challenges the rest of the battalion without the slightest hint of fear, promising to cut down each one of them if they dared to face him. However, her confident expression suddenly changes as she senses something approaching at high speed. Sensing the imminent danger, he shouts, attempting to manifest a mana shield in his fist to protect himself. However, a quick and deadly shot cuts through the defense and hits the boy's knee squarely. The warrior falls, bleeding profusely, into the mud, unable to stay on his feet. He clenches his teeth, enduring the extreme pain as he tries to understand what hit him. In the distance, atop a rocky cliff, two silhouettes observed the devastation. They were two masked snipers from the enemy army, calmly holding their rifles as they watched the mercenary fall. The traumatic memory causes Elric to wake with a start in his dark room. He sits up in bed, panting, a dagger pressed against his chest, his gaze fixed on high alert. Still drenched in sweat, his gaze carries the same fierce hostility of wartime. Slowly, he lowers the blade and tries to relax while observing the room's decor. The soft morning light illuminated the immense window of the luxurious room, bringing a calmness that the young man hadn't felt in a long time. Taking a deep breath, he suppresses his murderous instincts and reminds himself that he has finally returned home. Suddenly, knocks on the door startle him, and he acts purely on reflex, hiding the dagger behind his leg. Outside, Rhonda's voice echoes, asking if the young master is already awake. Elric hesitated for a moment, feeling sweat trickle down his face from the tension. Stuttering slightly, he confirms that he was already standing. Discreetly concealing the weapon, he flashes a friendly smile and invents a story about having just woken up. The housekeeper enters the spacious room carrying a basin in her hands. While she prepares everything, the warrior reflects on the absurd luxury of having ice-cold water served instantly first thing in the morning. After washing and putting on clean clothes from the mansion, he walks in, impressed by the lightness and softness of the fabric. Looking at his own reflection in the mirror, he feels he wasn't worthy of receiving so much pampering. The boy tries to force a charismatic smile, but his expression comes across as strange and unnatural. Leaving the room leaning on his cane, he concludes that all that time on the front lines had turned him into a bitter, stone-hearted man. He meets Rhonda in the hallway, who compliments him on his refreshed appearance and suggests they have breakfast together. The woman with glasses maintains her serene and dedicated posture, patiently awaiting the young master's response. Observing the boy's limping gait, The governess couldn't hide her curiosity and asked how his leg ended up like that. The bloody image of the bullet piercing his knee flashes through Elric's mind, but he knows he can't tell the truth. To avoid any unnecessary worry, he lies, saying that he had fallen down a steep embankment and hit a rock. At that moment, the sound of footsteps and the creaking of the floor attract the attention of the two. It was Tyria, who had arrived quietly, displaying her long blonde braid and a serene face. The young wife looks at him and politely asks if her husband had a good night's sleep. Immediately, the mercenary's mind recalls the harrowing vision from the previous night, of the girl huddled up wearing only a towel. Elric's face flushes with embarrassment, and he stammers a rushed reply to thank them for their hospitality. Breaking the tension, the young maid Marie points her finger in her boss's face and shouts, calling him a pervert. Not tolerating the audacity, Rhonda gives the girl a hard whack on the head for snooping on other people's baths. The housekeeper drags the maid down the hallway, leaving the two alone and wishing them a pleasant stay. Completely embarrassed by the situation, Elric clears his throat in an attempt to break the tension. The boy manages a weak smile and finally replies to Tyria that he had slept very well. Walking through the dining room, Elric remarks to his wife that he doesn't remember seeing the new housekeeper the last time he was home. When Tyria mentions that Marie had called him a pervert, the boy becomes completely embarrassed and slams his hand on the table in surprise. The noblewoman waved her hands quickly, trying to reassure him and asking him not to worry about it. The mercenary sits down again, resting his hand firmly on his cane. His face still flushed. He looks away and explains that he was simply curious because he had never seen the girl before. Tyria stares at him with her beautiful yellowish eyes, responding with a soft tone of doubt. The couple remained seated at the large table, enjoying their meal in sepulchral silence. The young girl chews her food with a calm and adorable expression. Suddenly her eyes widened slightly as she heard her husband bring up a topic. Holding his cutlery on his plate, Elric gathers the courage to speak about the incident from the previous day. Tyria immediately understood what it was about and finished the sentence, blushing, mentioning the embarrassment in the bathroom. The boy tries to offer a sincere apology, but his wife turns her face away and quickly says that everything was fine. He insists on explaining himself, but the girl asks him to just finish his breakfast, leaving him with no way out. A deep blush spreads across the noblewoman's face as she clutches her hands in her lap. She remains silent, clearly embarrassed by the memories. Sensing the awkward atmosphere, Elric scratches the back of his neck, unsure what to do, until he hears his wife call him by name. In Tyria's mind, the image of her husband dressed only in a bathrobe the previous night appears. She recalls the countless scars covering the warrior's chest, silently wondering what kind of life he had to lead to survive it all. The scene returns to the dining room, where the two continue eating without exchanging another word. Breaking in a cold sweat, Elric bitterly regretted bringing up the subject, feeling that this strangeness would drive him mad. In a desperate attempt to ignore the tension, the silverware begins to bang frantically against the plates. The young man comically swallows his food quickly, surprising his wife with his behavior. With his cheeks still puffed out, the mercenary jumps to his feet, gives a thumbs up, and announces that he's leaving. The large wooden doors of the room close immediately afterwards. Tyria lets out a small sigh, still processing her husband's sudden departure. With a sweet smile and flushed cheeks, she wishes him a good day. Upon leaving the room, Elric notices that the mansion is quite busy with the servants going about their morning chores. Guided by Rhonda, he takes the opportunity to greet the house's longtime employees, who welcome him with great joy. The friendly atmosphere is broken when an elderly butler excitedly asks if it was true that the young master had tried to attack his mistress the previous day, calling him a real man. Marie remains standing in the hallway, glaring at her boss with disdain and muttering that he was nothing but a pervert. The man reprimands the girl, and Elric sits on the sofa completely out of place while the argument unfolds before him. The young maid shouts indignantly, finding it absurd that the man would return after 10 years only to do this sort of thing. The butler chuckled and asked her not to be so harsh, claiming the girl was still too young to understand things. The experienced clerk patiently explains that a nobleman's primary duty was to produce an heir. With a proud smile, he argues that Elric merely followed his instincts and was true to his duties when he approached his wife in the bath. While the old man praises the boy as an example of masculinity and the maid retorts, Elric listens with his back turned, sweating with nervousness. The war veteran gives a forced laugh when the butler asks if all that determination meant he'd come back to stay. Gripping the handle of his cane tightly, the boy confesses that he still hadn't decided what his next step would be. In his thoughts, he contemplates the grandeur of the estate surrounded by wheat fields, wondering how he could act as the master of the place after having abandoned it. Determined to escape the conversation, Elric stood up, saying he needed to leave and that they would talk about it later, receiving respectful understanding from the butler. Without wasting any time, the young master asks Aldio to prepare the carriage immediately. A short time later, the vehicle crosses the dirt roads surrounding the sunlit mansion. Tyria watches the carriage pass by from afar, stopped in the middle of the wheat fields. Holding her hat against the wind, the girl watches her husband leave with a serene look. The carriage moves forward silently, leaving the golden lands and entering a path covered in autumn leaves. The journey ends in a secluded spot, where Elric disembarks and stops before a large gravestone. Facing the monument, the boy says aloud that a lot of time had passed. Under the sunlight, the stone tomb with the carved figure of an eagle marks the resting place of his late father. Elric's face takes on a grim expression as he confesses how deeply he harbored resentment towards that man. Surrounded by dry leaves falling in the breeze, he admits that despite everything, he never wanted their reunion to happen this way. Elric reflects on the figure of Hovin Portman, recalling how the patriarch elevated his family from mere merchants to the leading guild in the Wibben region through cruel actions that earned him countless enemies. Looking at the gravestone, the young man questions his deceased father, asking if he ever offered him a single smile or even a kind word, since he had chosen to live as a true villain until the end. With a mixture of melancholy and frustration, he murmurs that, because of all this, the old man should at least have lived a little longer. The young man lowers his gaze before the stone tomb, feeling the weight of the past as the autumn breeze rustles his clothes. Sighing deeply, Elric calmly confesses that he no longer harbors as much resentment towards the man as he once did. After concluding his silent farewell, the young master calls for the butler who accompanied him. The experienced official approaches, and the warrior finally inquires about the patriarch's cause of death, discovering that he had passed away due to a heart condition. The old butler explains that the master hid his condition from everyone until his final moments, leaving the young man slightly surprised by the revelation. Aldio continues the account, detailing that, realizing his days were numbered, Hovin dedicated all his efforts to closing down and liquidating a large part of his businesses. Elric gives a wry smile and turns his face away, commenting on how strange it was that the butler had followed such an insensitive man with such loyalty to the end. Maintaining his impeccable posture, the gentleman gives a friendly smile and promptly replies that he only stayed because of the money. The warrior narrowed his eyes suspiciously, noticing that the butler was deliberately omitting something, which left the old man somewhat confused. Elric then points out that the employee had just mentioned the inheritance, recalling that the patriarch liquidated as many assets as he could before he died, generating an incalculable fortune in cash. With a serious expression, the mercenary focuses on the fate of all that wealth hoarded by the family. The butler confirms Elric's suspicions, revealing that absolutely all the inheritance had been left in his name. Sometime after the visit to the grave, the Portman family carriage begins its journey back, cutting along a road surrounded by trees illuminated by the afternoon sun. Leaning against the car window, Elric observes the landscape thoughtfully and wonders if his father hadn't left any official will. Sitting outside directing the carriage, the clerk replies that Hovin wasn't the type of man who would do that, leaving only written instructions about the money that the boy could read later. The experienced butler confesses that, even after spending so much time with the deceased, he never managed to understand his true intentions behind that decision. He adds that the head of the family handled the division of assets with an unusual coldness, even by his own ruthless standards. As they cross the vast fields of the estate, Aldio advises the young master to take all the time he needs to decide what to do with all that fortune. Hearing the old man's peaceful advice, Elric's reddened eyes show a slight surprise. Immediately, the warrior's thoughts turn to Tyria and her solitary presence amidst the wheat fields. Coughing to disguise his own discomfort, Elric questions the butler about why the young woman still lives in the mansion, since the marriage should have been annulled after her sudden escape in her teens. Without taking his eyes off the road, the gentleman recalls that the union was purely political, functioning only as a disguised commercial transaction between the families. The young man understood that this was already sufficient reason to bind the girl to a contract, but the employee quickly added that there was a very important detail missing from this story. The butler reveals that, thanks to that old agreement, the Portmans had acquired the hereditary title of Baron, which would pass to Elric as soon as he accepted the inheritance. He emphasizes that absolutely all that money and power belonged solely to the young master by right and not to the abandoned wife. The luxurious carriage finally approaches the main entrance of the mansion under a clear sky. As he exits the vehicle, Elric reflects aloud that if Tyria's only goal was wealth, it wouldn't make sense for her to remain there for another year after the patriarch's death. The butler agrees, explaining that the noblewoman could easily have claimed the fortune as her attorney and left, making it clear that she chose to remain on the property of her own free will. The information catches the mercenary completely off guard, and he asks if Aldio had any idea of the reason behind this unusual decision. The old man sighs deeply and laments that, unfortunately, they never developed enough intimacy for his mistress to share her true feelings. In his mind, the young man perfectly understands the butler's situation, recalling the untouchable aura of the young woman that naturally deterred any approach from the servants. Elric gives an awkward smile, agreeing that she seemed difficult to deal with, being a complete stranger to him, but the lord quickly retorts, reminding him that, above all, Tyria was his wife. While petting the carriage horses, the employee smiles gently and advises his boss, stating that all great marriages began that way. With the old man's wise words echoing in his mind, Elric begins to limp up the mansion's stairs. As soon as he reaches the top, he comes face to face with Tyria, who is patiently waiting for him at the entrance, holding a cloth bag in her arms. The young woman's face was slightly flushed under the shadow of her large straw hat. She seemed somewhat nervous, clenching her hands where she displayed her old wedding ring. Noticing her husband approaching, the girl takes a small step towards the main doors. The warrior stood silently observing her, until the young noblewoman asked in her soft voice if he had just arrived. Delighted by her presence, the young man returns the question, wanting to know how long she had been waiting outside. Still blushing, the beautiful woman looks away and explains that she had just returned from her work in the wheat fields. The mere tone of the wife's voice instantly makes the face of the terrible sword-wielding demon burn with shame. Gathering what little courage he had left the battlefields, he suggests they enter the mansion together, and the girl politely accepts the invitation. The couple walk side by side through the luxurious main hall, ascending the property's imposing staircases in complete silence. Elric, cold and desperately trying to find some topic to break the tense atmosphere, internally cursed his own inability to converse with women. Observing his wife's figure, he notices that, even dressed in simple, dusty country clothes, she still exuded a natural aura of extreme elegance. The mercenary fixes his gaze on the young woman, trying to remember if she possessed all that dazzling charm 10 years ago. The image of Tyria on her wedding day, blushing slightly beneath her white veil, returns to the young man's mind. Brought back to reality, Elric gets a big shock when he realizes his wife is already standing right there in front of him. Completely clumsy, the warrior stumbles backward and hurriedly asks if the young woman is all right. His heavy cane strikes the ground forcefully, preventing an embarrassing fall. Disguising his nervousness with a forced smile, he makes up a story about his leg giving out from walking too much, wondering to himself how long she had been watching him. Climbing the mansion's staircases side by side with the noblewoman, the mercenary apologizes for not being able to carry that heavy bag for her due to his injury. Tyria insists everything was fine, and the young man feels the weight of his own hypocrisy as he offers belated apologies after leaving her completely alone for 10 years. The young woman stares at him silently with her large yellowish eyes. She explains that she was already quite used to that weight, as she had learned all the farm work directly from the patriarch. The boy understood immediately, recognizing that this was exactly his father's controlling way. He recalls that the old man couldn't rest until he had personally inspected every important matter, and the vast plantations were no exception. Elric deduces that, after closing all other family businesses to facilitate the inheritance, his father must have left the management of the wheat farm entirely in the hands of his daughter-in-law. Suddenly, Tyria's footsteps cease halfway up the stairs. She calls her husband's attention, and he promptly turns to listen to her. Standing beneath a huge portrait of the late Hovan Portman, the young woman curiously asks how her father-in-law used to spend his days. The girl confesses that, apart from the strict lessons about farm work, she couldn't remember almost anything else about the man. Hearing this, the warrior gripped the handle of his cane tightly. Showing a glimmer of hope, he asks if the patriarch ever happened to speak of his missing son. Tyria replies directly that it is not true, and the boy merely smiles resignedly at the painting. In his thoughts, he concludes that the combination of an insensitive father and a silent wife could only result in strictly professional conversations. Staring at Hoven's imposing painting on the wall, Elric murmured that he understood the situation. The young woman asks permission to return to her duties, surprising her husband, as he thought she had already finished her work in the fields. As they walk back down the hallway, the noblewoman reveals that she still needs to review the property paperwork, causing the young man to stammer in shock. Incredulous, he asks if the girl tended to the harvest during the day and also reviewed the documents at night, which she readily confirms. The wife bids him farewell, mentioning that she would see him again at dinner, and continues on her way through the hall. Elric watches her leave in absolute silence. An immense wave of guilt washes over him as he imagines the young woman working late into the night in a dark office, taking on all the responsibilities that should have been his. The boy felt his conscience would be much lighter if she simply expressed hatred for the abandonment, but up to that point, Tyria hadn't made a single complaint. With a heavy heart, the young master continues his journey, limping through the house. Distracted, he opens the door to the old office very abruptly. The sudden bang startles young Marie, who was tidying up the place, and causes dozens of letters to fall all over the floor. The maid panics, unsure what to do in front of her master, while Elric simply observes the jumble of envelopes. Ignoring the pain in his knee, the boy bends down to help her gather the paperwork and asks what it's all about. Marie explains that all those letters were addressed to her mistress, sparking the warrior's curiosity. Elric gives a slight smile, impressed by the sheer number of letters addressed to his wife. However, his expression changes drastically when he notices a very specific detail on the paper. He recognizes the Wibben family wax seal on one of the envelopes, with a message on the front dedicated to his beloved daughter. The young master stands up and begins to read the contents of the paper with a stern expression. The Baron's letter implored Tyria to stop waiting for a man who wouldn't return, suggesting she take everything she could and go back to her family home to find a new husband. The young man reflects on the irony of his own father, who prepared the inheritance exclusively for his son, but left his daughter-in-law without a single penny in her name after a whole decade of hard work. Putting the paper back on the table, he concludes that taking all the family's money and leaving would have been more than enough to pay for the young woman's suffering. Sitting at the late patriarch's table, the young man wonders if she continued to endure life on the estate solely because of that absurd inheritance. However, this logic quickly begins to crumble in his mind. Lost in thought, the warrior carefully analyzes the chronology of recent events. Her red eyes focus on a distant point as the truth begins to become clear. He understands that if Tyria's true objective was to get rich, she could simply have taken all the money as a lawyer and disappeared a year ago, shortly after her father-in-law's death. Elric settles into the large chair, staring seriously at the letter in his hands. He opens one of the office drawers and confirms his suspicions when he finds it completely full of mail bearing the red stamp. Picking up another envelope, he realizes that Tyria's family started sending those persistent messages exactly a year ago. Elric discovers that all the letters encouraged her to take the inheritance money, but his young wife never responded to any of them, even with her father repeatedly pleading for a reply. Elric let out a long sigh at the sight of the mountain of mail hidden in his father's drawer. Sitting at his old office desk, he reflects that his wife had spent all that time protecting the family legacy, even without any guarantee that he would ever return. The young master concludes that Tyria had concealed the truth flawlessly, since not even the experienced butler Aldio suspected the situation. Looking out the large window, he watches the noblewoman working in the wheat fields and understands that she had fought that battle completely alone for the entire past year. Under the soft afternoon light, Tyria held the sheaves of harvest with a serene and solitary expression. Elric murmurs to himself that he wouldn't have the slightest right to blame her if she had taken the entire inheritance and left forever. Later, in one of the mansion's luxurious rooms, Tyria sits facing her large dressing table. The young woman begins to carefully untie the ribbons from her long blonde hair. Looking at her reflection in the mirror, she adjusts her golden hair, her cheeks slightly flushed, preparing for the end of the day. Suddenly, young Marie bursts into the room quite agitated, with some big news. The maid clasps her hands together and almost shouts with excitement as she announces that the young master had asked to see Tyria before anyone else. However, the girl's expression quickly changes to anger as she remembers her boss's behavior the previous night. Tyria becomes a little confused as the employee changes the subject and starts chattering about how producing an heir soon would be great for the lady of the house. Extremely excited about her own idea, Marie begins to stomp her feet non-stop on the wooden floor. Unable to contain her anger, the maid approaches and firmly grasps the noblewoman's dress. The girl kneels beside her employer, dramatically pleading for her attention. With comical tears in her eyes, Marie reaffirms that Elric was a pervert and a scoundrel for abandoning her for 10 years, but admits that Aldio was right in saying that it would be good for the two of them to connect. In a burst of absurd honesty, the maid shouts, demanding that Tyria run to share the bed with her husband and have a baby right away. The noblewoman gives a rather awkward smile as she listens to the girl plan that they would have 3 children, speculating about who would inherit the father's perverted personality and who would be as kind as the mother. The maid's absurd monologue is interrupted by sudden knocks on the door, startling the 2 women. Outside, Aldio announces that it's time, and Tyria promptly replies that she's just leaving. Accompanied by the elderly butler, the young woman walks elegantly through the corridors of the property. Midway through the journey, the wife wonders aloud what the conversation might be about, and Aldio remarks that this was the first time Elric had requested a formal meeting. Upon arrival at their destination, the employee opens the large ornate doors of the hall. The butler announces the arrival of Tyria, who waits timidly at the entrance. Elric was sitting alone at a small tea table bathed in sunlight and greeted her in a friendly manner. The beautiful woman enters the room in absolute silence and with her head bowed. The young woman's heels echoed through the room as she calmly walked towards her husband. The mercenary takes the opportunity to take a sip from his cup, trying to disguise his own tension. The two finally sit facing each other in the spacious, brightly lit hall. Without wasting any time, Elric places the envelope with the red seal on the towel and apologizes for having bumped into those letters while a servant was tidying the office. He slides the paper toward his wife and asks if she could explain what it was about. Tyria's large yellowish eyes widen, clearly taken by surprise by the accidental discovery. The young woman's face is clouded with worry, and she lowers her head, unsure what to say. In her thoughts, she panics, fearing that Elric would judge her as a shameless woman who was only there for the family fortune. However, the warrior breaks the silence, stating that he already knew she had spent the entire last year ignoring all those calls from the Wibbin family. Looking at her seriously, he asks the real reason why she protected the inheritance without having the slightest guarantee that her husband would return alive from the war. The young man insists that she could very well have taken all that money for herself and gone on with her own life, leaving the noblewoman speechless. Tyria listens to her husband's logical words and sadly understands that, in his view, she was merely a stranger from whom the worst was expected. In the mind of the traumatized warrior, the pure actions of that solitary woman were a great mystery that made no sense. Clutching her skirt tightly, the girl hears Elric question once more why she didn't simply return to her homeland. Still with her head down, the young woman whispers the surname Portman firmly. She raises her face with a determined expression and declares loudly and clearly that her name is Tyria Portman. Without backing down, the young woman asserts that she was no longer just a lady of the Wibben family, but the true mistress of that house. After the strong statement, she abruptly rises from her chair and excuses herself, explaining that she still needs to finish her daily obligations. Elric watched his wife turn her back and hurry away from the table. The young master is completely speechless at the incisive and unexpected response from his first love. The noblewoman disappears down the mansion's corridors, leaving the warrior alone with his own thoughts in the tea room. Outside, Tyria leans against the wall, her face burning with anger, remembering his suggestion that she might have kept all the money for herself. With her heart racing and her lips trembling, the girl stammers to herself, trying to formulate the answer she didn't have the courage to say to her husband's face. Tyria bit her lip, trying to contain the immense shame that was taking over her face. With tears in her eyes, the young noblewoman gathers her courage and finally declares that she remained in the mansion simply because she was his wife. The scene shifts, focusing on Elric's steady hand gripping a dagger. The boy sat silently in his room, twirling the blade as he reflected deeply on the conversation he had had with the girl. The memory of Tyria firmly declaring that she was no longer a Wibben, but the lady of the Portman family, echoed repeatedly in her mind. In a swift movement, the mercenary throws the dagger, forcefully plunging it into the wood of a piece of furniture. Staring at the gun pinned to the wall, he wonders if his wife's unwavering demeanor stemmed solely from her sense of responsibility and duty as a noblewoman. He concludes that the young woman had protected everything that remained of the property without seeking any personal gain, realizing that this selfless attitude reminded him of someone very familiar. The boy's mind travels to the past, bringing back the image of a white-haired knight named Elvis Graham. Elric remembers meeting the man on the battlefield when he was hired as a mercenary to fight in the territorial war led by that nobleman's family, resulting in a great victory with few casualties. However, the conflict took a heavy toll, leaving Elvis permanently incapacitated in a wheelchair and unable to fight again. At the time, the wounded nobleman merely smiled peacefully and stated that he had done it to fulfill his duty. He explained that those born into nobility needed to bear the weight of their positions and set an example, using war merely as a stage to fulfill this obligation. Young Elric, still inexperienced, had questioned the reason for such sacrifice, remembering that the man was the son of a concubine and therefore only a half-commoner. Maintaining a light-hearted tone, Elvis replied that he preferred to see himself as a half-noble, justifying that by fulfilling half of his responsibilities, it was fair to lose half of his own body. The retired knight then decided to spend the rest of his life carefree and married a few years later, fulfilling his promise. Back in the present, the warrior removes the dagger from the wood with a firm pull. Standing before the piece of furniture, Elric murmurs to himself about the weight of this responsibility and duty. With a determined look, he accepts that he cannot give back the 10 years that Tyria had sacrificed, but decides that he will not stand idly by in the face of that situation. The young master knows that the Wibben family wouldn't stop sending letters demanding the inheritance, deducing that they only sent the correspondence because they probably couldn't afford to visit the property in person. Since his wife was too reserved to reveal her true thoughts and anxieties, the young man understood that trying to get the answers directly from her would be pointless. Because of this, he decides to seek the truth in his own way, immediately setting off on a carriage ride. Elric's destination was the imposing and luxurious estate of the Wibben family. Standing before the large golden gates, the young man assesses the building's facade before initiating his direct approach. Leaning on his cane, he comments ironically on the grandeur of the mansion, preparing to use the skill he was most confident in: confrontation. Within the property, news of the unwanted son-in-law's arrival spreads rapidly. Baron Wibben paces angrily through the corridors, complaining to his wife about how that useless commoner always found a way to infuriate him. The Baroness, fanning herself with a fan, disdainfully agrees and accuses the young man of having returned only to sniff out the inheritance. With a somber expression, the family patriarch ponders the serious problem that would ensue if Elric attempted to claim the inherited fortune. The woman gives a wicked smile from behind her fan, already plotting a way to turn the situation to her advantage. The couple continued walking through the luxurious halls, aligning their greedy thoughts. The Baron mutters disgustedly that the mercenary was just trash who only cared about money. The Baroness completes her thought by mentioning the costs of raising her daughter and how the girl wasted 10 years of her own life because of that arranged marriage. The man sets his sights on his goal, determined to get his hands on Hovan Portman's enormous inheritance. With firm steps, he decides that he would use that fortune as fair compensation for everything they had been through. The nobleman gripped the drawing-room doorknob tightly, ready for combat. As soon as the large double doors open, Elric calmly turns to face his in-laws. The young man gives a slight bow as he sits at the tea table, formally introducing himself and apologizing for taking a decade to greet them. The Baron sits with his arms crossed next to his wife and replies cynically that it had indeed been very difficult to see his son-in-law's face all that time. Without wasting time on false pleasantries, Elric announces that he was only there because he had read the letter they had sent to Tyria's mansion. The old man scoffs at the fact that he only read the message now, but takes the opportunity to play the victim, pretending to have written it out of pity for his daughter who lived completely alone. Adopting an aggressive tone, the nobleman accuses the young man of being shameless for abandoning the girl even after the Wibbens elevated the Portmans to nobility. With an arrogant laugh, the Baron humiliates his son-in-law, calling him a useless cripple and doubting his ability to manage any amount of money. The older man adjusts his tie and points out that, in the end, it was Tyria who managed the entire property and saved what remained. Revealing his true intentions, the patriarch openly declares that the Wibben family would receive the entire Portman inheritance as a form of payment. The Baron continues to provoke him, suggesting that Elric wouldn't even know what to do with that fortune, attempting to invalidate any right the young man might have. The Baroness supports her husband, arguing that the mercenary lacked the capacity to assume the position and that this would be the only way to compensate for their daughter's emotional suffering. Behind their feigned concern, the minds of the two nobles exuded monstrous greed as they vowed to put all that money to excellent use. Hearing that repugnant speech, Elric sighed slightly, his face hidden by his hair. The warrior's expression changes completely, revealing a bloodshot gaze of pure fury and disgust as he realizes that, with his father's death, those bloodsuckers were trying to devour his wife and his family's legacy. The young man realizes that his in-laws didn't care at all about their own daughter, being willing to take away the young woman's land just to line their own pockets. Staring at the table with his hands clasped together, Elric feels such revulsion at that greed that he can barely continue listening. Keeping his cool, he interrupts the couple and begins to speak. The warrior apologizes for not bringing his wife with him, explaining that she was too busy with property duties. Baron Wibben loses his patience, banging his fist on the table and demanding that his son-in-law stop changing the subject and focus on the inheritance matter. Sitting quietly with his cup of tea, the mercenary listens as the old man states that it wouldn't be fair for him to claim the fortune after having abandoned the place for 10 years. Elric covers his face with his hand, muttering about his own greed. With a reddened and intimidating look, he finally calls the Baron by name and asks what exactly the man would do if he decided to be greedy. The nobleman sweats profusely and stammers, not understanding, while the young man repeats the question, wanting to know what his attitude would be if he were to inherit the fortune. Silence falls over the room, and Elric mocks the patriarch for suddenly becoming quiet after speaking so gruffly. The young master slams his hand on the table, asking if his father-in-law's arrogant mouth had finally dried up. Completely offended, the Baron stood up shouting, calling the boy insolent. Without changing his tone of voice, Elric glares at the man and states that he finally understood the situation. The mercenary recalls his 10 years surviving on the battlefields, where he learned that there was no need for excessive displays of anger. To the sword-wielding demon, it made absolutely no difference whether or not he found meaning in the carnage of his actions. Facing the terrified old man, the young man advises him that it would be much better for him to keep his mouth shut if he wants to keep the money he is currently receiving. With a mocking smile, Elric finds the whole scene pathetic, since the only person who truly had any right to the inheritance was Tyria. Leaning on his cane, the warrior stands up and turns his back, declaring that it was the couple who were being consumed by greed. The Baron is in despair and threatens to march onto the Portman family lands to tear them apart, but his son-in-law merely encourages him to try his luck as he walks towards the door. Looking over his shoulder with a grim expression, Elric says that he will be waiting. A short time later, the young master's carriage leaves the Wibbin estate, traveling along a peaceful, sunlit road. Inside the vehicle, the young man covers his face with his hand, taking a deep breath and trying to process what he had just done. The adrenaline wears off and guilt hits him, making him wonder if he was really any different from those old men. Feeling that in his wife's eyes, he was just another sinner, he internally questions whether the aggressive confrontation he had in the salon was truly to protect the girl. Sitting alone with his cane, the warrior wonders if he didn't say all those things simply because he was blinded by his own superiority complex. The harsh truth is that what he felt at that moment was not compassion, but rather a bizarre satisfaction in crushing Tyria's parents into submission. The memory of her late father, always so authoritarian, haunts her like a ghost. Elric lowers his head in shame, concluding that in the end, he was just an egoist, exactly like Hovan Portman. Outside the carriage, the driver pulls the reins to stop the horses. The boy slams his hand on the side of the cabin in a brusque movement. As soon as he gets out of the vehicle, he leans against the carriage door in the middle of the road, breathing heavily and panting. His eyes widen as his dark thoughts consume him. Standing before the plantation, he confesses to himself that he is a despicable and beyond redemption human being. Suddenly, the sound of something moving catches the warrior's attention. He turned his face away, startled and still breathless, trying to see who was there. His expression changes to pure surprise. In the middle of the vast wheat field, illuminated by the setting sun, he spots Tyria standing in the distance. The young woman exuded a serene aura under the orange light, with the breeze gently swaying her clothes and golden hair. The young man murmurs his wife's name in shock. Without thinking twice, he starts running. The young master races desperately across the field, reflecting on how much that girl had suffered because of her own family. While running against the wind, he understands that her torment also extended to her deceased father. Ignoring the confused looks from the butler and the maid, Elric moves forward, feeling that even he had destroyed her life. Tyria turned her face away in surprise as she saw him approach, while the mercenary concluded that absolutely everyone around the young woman had only caused her pain. Elric finally catches up to her and firmly holds the girl's hands. The noblewoman is confused by her husband's sudden, breathless behavior in front of her. In the middle of the plantation, the sword-wielding demon lowers his head, bowing before his first love. Tyria's eyes widen in astonishment when the young man finally offers a sincere apology for having abandoned her completely alone for 10 long years. The warrior collapses in regret as he continues his lament, deeply saddened by having tried to justify his selfish actions as if they were for her own good. The girl listens, paralyzed, as Elric asserts that every drop of suffering she has endured throughout her life is entirely his fault. The story flashes back in time, revealing a young boy fiercely scaring away a pack of wild dogs with a stick to protect a little girl. After shooing the animals away, little Elric turns to the blonde girl and asks if she's all right or if she's been bitten anywhere. Young Tyria murmured that she was all right, but her frightened gaze fixed on the boy's leg, which was bleeding profusely. Realizing the injury, Elric cries out in pain upon noticing that the monsters had left a deep mark on him. Seeing the boy suffering, the girl timidly asks him to come closer for a moment. As she carefully bandages the wound, the young man introduces himself as Elric Portman, saying that she didn't need to thank him, as he was only helping because the incident had occurred on his family's land. The two sit together on the grass, and the boy, bothered by her silence, suggests that it would be good for her to stay by his side, since one day he would become a royal knight. Tyria simply stares at him, her cheeks flushed, maintaining her usual silence. She finishes bandaging the wound and stands up, receiving an awkward thank you from the future mercenary. Observing the skillful work, Elric remarks that she looked like a noblewoman, but he's curious to know where she learned to treat wounds so well. The little girl whispers that her nanny used to treat her, but her voice is so low that the boy has to ask her to speak louder. Pressed, Tyria becomes extremely embarrassed and looks away with a cute pout. The young man grumbled irritably, questioning how she expected to ever get married being so shy. His face completely red, Elric murmurs that if he were truly to become a royal knight, he would accept her as his bride. The sudden declaration makes the little girl's heart race with emotion. Unable to cope with his own embarrassment at the lack of response, the boy loses his temper and yells at her not to think too highly of herself just because she's pretty, making up a story that he only wanted her around because she was a good healer. He runs off sulking, warning that when he becomes a great warrior she will beg to marry him, while internally suffering from having been ignored until the end. Left behind, young Tyria gives a sweet and loving smile. The nostalgic memory brings to mind the confident image of young Elric Portman from that time. Currently, Tyria lovingly holds a picture frame containing an old photo of her husband as a child. With a gentle smile, the young woman reflects that he never ended up becoming a royal knight, but concludes that they met again anyway, wondering if she could call it destiny. The scene shifts to the family's grand mansion, where the housekeeper Rhonda asks the maid Marie to prepare tea for her employers in the light of dusk. Accompanied by her housekeeper, the lady of the house walks apprehensively through the elegant corridors of the palace. As she follows the employee, the noblewoman can't stop thinking about the heavy expression her husband had earlier. A feeling of anxiety grips Tyria, who wonders the real reason she was called for that conversation. Upon arriving at her destination, Rhonda knocks on the door and announces the arrival of the young master. Inside the luxurious office, Elric sat waiting seriously, and his wife soon took her place in the armchair opposite him. Hesitantly, Tyria breaks the silence, saying she has something to share with him. The warrior readily agrees, revealing that he too had asked to see her precisely because he had something very important to say. The young master stares at her intently and finally apologizes formally. The girl is completely astonished by his direct attitude. Elric explains that he needed to redeem himself for leaving her behind on their wedding day, 10 years ago. He admits that he was very foolish and impulsive at the time, unable to see the true consequences of his reckless actions. The young man acknowledges the wounds she had to endure alone and the difficult times she faced in isolation, reiterating his deep regret. With a sincere expression, he asks if she could accept his apologies. Surprised by his frankness, Tyria replies gently that he had no reason to apologize. The noblewoman insists she never held a grudge against anyone and affirms that continuing to live on the property was entirely her own choice. However, Elric argues that if things continued this way, her heart would never find true peace. Touched by her husband's kind words, Tyria blushes and smiles beautifully, saying she would accept his apology. A genuine sense of relief washes over the young man, who returns the smile with a light and satisfied smile. The warrior expresses his gratitude for her understanding, formally addressing his wife as Madam. After the conversation, the two walk side by side through the hall, the sound of Elric's cane echoing on the floor. Concerned, Tyria asks if his leg is feeling a little better, but he assures her he's fine and tries to change the subject. The boy apologizes once again for taking up her time when she should be busy, but the girl asks him to stop saying things like that. The young woman stops in the middle of the hallway, drawing his attention, and her husband asks her to tell him what she was thinking. Tyria's face burns with shame, as she timidly asks him to stop addressing her with formal and distant titles. Sweating profusely and extremely nervous, the girl stammers, trying to muster the courage to ask him to call her his wife. Elric can't hear the end of the confused sentence and approaches, asking her to repeat what she had said. At that precise moment, the door behind them is violently flung open by Marie, who excitedly shouts, announcing tea time alongside the butler. The sudden fright causes Elric to completely lose his balance, dropping his cane and stumbling disastrously towards Tyria. The clumsy stumble causes Elric to fall directly on top of Tyria, pinning the young woman to the ground in an extremely compromising position. The scene leaves young Marie in shock, dropping her tea tray in tears while the old butler covers his mouth with an amused smile, commenting that the employers were already planning an heir. Completely panicked and with his face burning with shame, the warrior leaps to his feet, shouting to Aldio that the situation was nothing like that. While Elric desperately tries to explain himself to his wife, the butler covers the maid's eyes, advising them to pretend not to see the adult matter and ignoring the girl's screams that her mistress was being devoured alive. The old employee gives a thumbs up, promising to warn the other servants not to disturb the couple from then on, causing the young man to shout even more angrily, denying everything. Not knowing where to hide his face, the mercenary turns his back and raises his hands in a defensive gesture, stammering another apology to the young woman. Still lying on the rug, Tyria covers her extremely flushed face, her trembling voice pleading with her husband to step away for a moment. Through the crack in the closing door, Aldio peeks one last time and tells them to take all the time they need, causing the boy to shout the old man's name indignantly. The large wooden doors of the office close with a dry thud. Outside the imposing mansion under the starry sky, Elric's voice still echoed muffled, insisting in vain that it was all a misunderstanding. The eventful night comes to an end, giving way to the bright rays of the morning sun streaming through the property's immense windows. Walking down the corridors, the housekeeper Rhonda notices the young master coughing to clear his throat and asks if he needs anything. The young man gives a friendly smile and simply wishes the bespectacled employee a good day. The woman noticed that her boss seemed to be in a very good mood and asked in a teasing tone if anything special had happened the previous night. She approaches stealthily and whispers in his ear, playfully speculating about the rumors of a future heir for the family. Elric's face instantly turns red, and he frantically denies everything, blaming the old butler's absurd gossip, which elicits a laugh from the housekeeper, who laments it's all lies. Adopting a more serious demeanor, the employee turns her back and warns the young man that the events of the previous night shouldn't end as just a simple accident, leaving him confused. Rhonda turned abruptly and stared at him sternly, questioning if he truly didn't understand the gravity of the situation. The housekeeper pressures him, reminding him that 10 years of neglect weighed far more cruelly on a woman, demanding that the warrior stop making Tyria feel lonely. Meanwhile, in her mistress's chambers, the beautiful noblewoman awakens peacefully in her spacious bed under the morning light. The young woman sits hugging a small object with a dreamy smile on her face, wondering if she was just imagining how invigorating that morning seemed. She gazes fondly at the old portrait of Elric as a child and sweetly asks if he slept well. Placing the painting back on the table, she reflects on the happiness of feeling that the distance between them had decreased even further after the unfortunate incident. Tyria stretches with a radiant smile on her face, excitedly wondering if she should now go and greet her husband every morning. The day continues peacefully, with a clear blue sky covering the vast golden wheat fields of the farm. Inside the house, the couple sits at opposite ends of the large dining table to share a morning meal. The two of them cut their plates of eggs and bread in a silence that seemed endless. Tyria chews her food gracefully, appearing quite serene and content with the moment. Elric was already sweating profusely as he ate, sensing the tense and awkward atmosphere, wondering if all this strangeness was due to the disaster of the previous day. He recalls the image of his wife blushing and embarrassed on the office floor until he is pulled from his thoughts by her voice calling him. The warrior is startled, almost jumping out of his chair, and stammers quickly, asking the girl to speak. A little shy, the young woman looks away and asks if he would have some free time that day to accompany her on a walk. The boy is confused by the sudden invitation and repeats the word walk to make sure he heard it correctly. Noticing her husband's surprise, Tyria waves her hands hurriedly and blushes even more, explaining that there was no ulterior motive, and that it was merely the traditional routine inspection of the harvest festival. Elric remembers the annual farm event and relaxes his shoulders, perfectly understanding the need for the patrol. With a kind smile, the mercenary accepts the invitation and agrees to escort her during the journey. The husband's positive response makes the young woman break into a charming smile of pure happiness. A little later, backstage at the mansion, the maids prepare the lady of the house, asking from behind the large doors if the dress is too tight. Surrounded by her servants, Tyria examines her elegant dark blue dress in the mirror, while the housekeeper instructs on the final adjustments. Satisfied with the wonderful result, Rhonda says she will check her boss's attire and leaves the room with firm steps. Upon encountering Elric in one of the hallways, the woman with glasses smiles, saying that he seemed to have already finished getting ready. However, the housekeeper's expression instantly changes to a look of pure hatred as she analyzes the young man's choices. The war veteran was dressed in a ridiculous leather outfit and a gigantic hat, innocently asking what the problem with that outfit would be for a patrol. Rhonda doesn't think twice and violently drags the young master by the arm, arguing that they would conduct an inspection, not march to the battlefield dressed as bandits. She shoves him into an empty room and slams the heavy doors shut in fury. Elric tries to resist, saying that he knew very well how to dress himself. The housekeeper ignores his protests and roughly throws him against a bench, ordering him to stay seated there. Snapping her gloves with a menacing smile, she decrees that a nobleman should dress with proper dignity and that she will change his clothes that very second, while the young man continues trying to refuse her help. Completely impatient, the woman begins to tear off and throw Tyria's husband's ugly clothes into the air, ignoring his pleas for calm. The sword-wielding demon bursts into nervous laughter as he tries to protect himself, begging the employee to simply pick out the right clothes and leave the room immediately. The housekeeper is undeterred and teases the young master, asking if he is ashamed, reminding him that he used to run around the house naked when he was a child. The young man shouts, denying the story, and tugs at his own shirt, demanding that the employee stop talking nonsense and just help him. Without any warning, Rhonda lunges forward and tears his clothes off with her bare hands in a brusque movement, causing the warrior to fall backward in shock. However, the woman's amused smile instantly vanishes, giving way to an expression of pure shock as she covers her mouth. With his torso exposed, Elric reveals a body covered in numerous deep war scars. Completely horrified by the sight, the housekeeper trembled from head to toe and asked what on earth all those marks were. The boy quickly tries to cover his chest with his torn shirt, confessing shyly that this was the reason he wanted to change alone. Rhonda approaches him with a look full of pain and pity, tearfully questioning what he had gone through during all those years he was missing. The mercenary gently holds the woman's trembling hands and apologizes, promising to tell her everything when the time is right. With a warm and sincere smile, he begs the employee to keep that secret and not tell Tyria anything. The loyal governess squeezes the young master's hand as a single tear rolls down her face, understanding the weight of the request. Wiping his face and regaining his composure, Rhonda agrees to keep it a secret and declares that from that day forward, she would be the only person to help him get dressed. Sometime later, the young man leaves the mansion and walks to the carriage, asking the butler if everything is ready for departure. Elric displays a confident smile, now dressed in an elegant and impeccable nobleman's attire. Aldio looks at him approvingly, confessing that he feared seeing his boss dressed as a bandit to scare his wife, but that, fortunately, he was wrong. Laughing, the boy admits that it almost happened, but that Rhonda's scolding and intuition had saved the day. At that moment, the conversation is interrupted by the arrival of Tyria, who approaches and apologizes for the delay. The young woman looked absolutely stunning in a long dress, and blushed shyly as she confessed that she had put extra effort into her appearance because it was their first outing together. The sword-wielding demon is completely mesmerized by his wife's beauty, his face flushing as he stammers a heartfelt compliment. While the girl thanks her with a sweet smile, Rhonda watches everything from afar, deciding that she would keep the scars a secret just to continue seeing that genuine happiness on her boss's face. Elric offers his arm to his wife, and the two enter the carriage, departing under a beautiful blue morning sky. The vehicle arrives at the estate's lively commercial district, where the arrival of the nobles does not go unnoticed. A great commotion fills the cobblestone street, with residents gossiping and wondering if the heir who ran away from home had really returned. Walking side by side with Tyria, The boy smiles somewhat awkwardly as he receives greetings and playful banter from the villagers. In the grocery section, an older saleswoman recognizes the young master and hugs him affectionately, praising the handsome man he had become. As he passed by the shops, other residents were also surprised by the young man's return and welcomed him with great joy and familiarity. One of them notices Elric's limping gait and jokes that a future lord needs to be strong and healthy, while the warrior makes up the excuse that it's just a minor injury. Suddenly, an excited shout calling him boss makes the boy look back in surprise. It was Bart, Elric's best childhood friend, who sported a huge smile upon seeing his old companion again. Without hesitation, the two handshake firmly, filled with nostalgia. They hug, exchanging laughs, with Elric joking that he almost didn't recognize his friend after he'd changed so much. The villager takes the opportunity to formally greet the lady of the house, and Tyria responds very politely. Excited about the reunion, Bart invites the boy to the tavern for a drink after the Harvest Festival party. Elric smiles genuinely and promises to join them later. The couple bids farewell, waving to their friend, and continues their stroll through the bustling market. Watching the two walk away, Bart smiles, realizing he never expected that marriage to work out, but concludes that they made a beautiful couple. The day stretches into a beautiful late afternoon, with the couple's carriage crossing the wheat fields bathed in the golden sunset. In the comfort of their cabin, Elric attentively observes his wife, who is engrossed in reading a large book. He notices the title on the cover and realizes it's a very technical botanical encyclopedia. The boy swallows hard and calls the young woman by name, looking somewhat apprehensive. Tyria lowers the book slightly and replies promptly, waiting to hear what he had to say. With his face slightly flushed, the young master asks her to teach him everything about farm work, revealing his desire to help manage the property from then on. He explains that he wanted to take all that burden off her shoulders and finally start acting as the true leader of the family, even if it was a little late for that. The young man begs her to be patient and guide him, assuring her that it would be very helpful, and nervously awaits a response. Hiding her smile behind the book, Tyria feels very happy to see how responsible and reliable her husband had become. The young noblewoman closes the botanical encyclopedia and elegantly rests the book on her lap. She stares at Elric with a determined and slightly provocative look, asking if she would be allowed to be as strict with him as the late lord had been with her. The young man let out a relieved laugh and placed his hand on his chest, telling her to feel free to be as strict as possible. As the carriage approaches the Portman mansion under the orange sky, he even jokingly asks if her father used to scold her a lot, with the girl boasting about learning everything very quickly. The tranquility of the couple's lands gives way to a different scene as night falls, revealing a distant tavern located near the dangerous border of Chevor. In a bustling tavern located near the Chevor border, dozens of patrons enjoy the evening drinking and chatting. Suddenly, the sound of firm footsteps echoes across the wooden floor, drawing everyone's attention with an arrogant curse. The bartender stops cleaning a glass and looks up, completely confused by the sudden interruption. At the entrance of the establishment, a mysterious red-haired woman wearing a cape announces that she will only ask one question once. With a serious and intimidating look, the newcomer demands to know where the sword demon, Kasha, was. Far away, the imposing Portman family mansion is bathed in the beautiful golden light of dusk. Inside the property, Tyria focuses all her attention on signing and organizing a large pile of farm documents. Accompanying her to the office, Elric approaches and asks if she usually deals with so much paperwork every day, but the young woman clarifies that this only happened during the busiest times of the year. The noblewoman pauses her work and calls her husband, who promptly asks her to tell him what she was thinking. Somewhat hesitantly, the girl asks if he wouldn't consider giving a speech during the Harvest Festival to celebrate his return to the family lands. The warrior gives a forced smile, feeling somewhat uncomfortable with the idea of speaking in public. Immediately, his mind travels back to the old days on the battlefield, remembering commanders shouting words of encouragement to the troops before battles. The young man reflects that, back when he lived as the mercenary Kasha, he never paid attention to those motivational speeches. He had never stood on a platform to lead anyone, and even less did he intend to do so someday. with a somber expression. He acknowledges that his only reason for being on the battlefield was far more sinister. The truth is that he was advancing frantically against the enemy armies only because he needed a target to unleash all his senseless rage. Wielding his blade mercilessly, the sword demon unleashed veritable bloodbaths as he tore his opponents in two. Elric admits that he acted like a real rabid dog, brutally taking down anyone who got in his way. Given such a bloody past, he finds it completely absurd that someone like him could give a peaceful speech, until he is pulled from his reverie by his wife's voice calling him. The young master quickly snaps back to reality and apologizes to the noblewoman, claiming he had been distracted for a moment. Trying to smooth things over, he gently suggests that Tyria give the speech in his place, promising that he would stay by her side the whole time. The young woman agrees with the idea in a comprehensive manner and accepts the responsibility of addressing the people that year. With flushed cheeks and a loving smile, Tyria concluded internally that there was no rush, as having her husband finally by her side was more than enough for her. The long-awaited Harvest Festival day arrives, gathering a crowd of residents in the central square as the lady of the house gives thanks for everyone's hard work. With an elegant demeanor, the noblewoman concludes her speech by asking the people to enjoy the festivities and have as much fun as possible. The audience goes wild at the boss's words, raising their fists and shouting with pure excitement. After fulfilling their duty, Elric holds his wife's hand and suggests that they also enjoy the event together. The couple walks hand in hand through the decorated streets, attracting the surprised and curious glances of the villagers. One of the cooks at the festival offers a stew to her boss, whose mouth waters at the sight of the elaborate dish. Right next to him, another worker serves a large mug of beer to the young master, who accepts the drink with a smile. Surrounded by the contagious energy of the place, the two walk together, thanking everyone for their hospitality and wishing them a wonderful party. Suddenly, Tyria's eyes widened as she noticed something interesting happening in the middle of the crowd. Quite excited, she points ahead and calls her husband's attention to the attraction. A royal court jester was giving a rare performance on a wooden stage, attracting dozens of spectators. The entertainer announces that his main trick would be the famous sword swallower. The artist throws his head back and slides the entire blade down his own throat, leaving Tyria completely shocked by the feat. The noblewoman claps, marveling at the man's skill, while the other court jesters celebrate the success of the performance. Elric observes his wife's excited reaction, but maintains an impassive expression before the spectacle. Noticing her husband's disinterest, the girl asks if he didn't find the trick impressive, and the young man merely deflects, saying that he'd seen many men swallow swords before. After the presentation, the couple comes across a knife-throwing booth. The stall owner invites the lord to play, and the village children become extremely excited upon realizing that the nobleman will participate. The game consisted of hitting targets made of apples hanging on wooden shelves to win a prize. Elric hesitates for a moment, claiming it had been a while since he last held a knife, but the little boys begin to beg him to show off his skills. Tyria gently takes his hand and joins in the fun, asking with a lovely smile for him to join the children's enjoyment. Unable to say no to his wife, the mercenary gives in to her requests and positions himself to make a few throws, eliciting cheers from the boys. The stall owner laughs and tells the lord not to be nervous, unaware that the young man's gaze had taken on the same lethal and grim precision as on the battlefield. In the blink of an eye, Elric hurls the blades with frightening mastery, plunging all three weapons precisely into the slender stems of the apples without damaging the fruit. The absurd skill leaves the booth owner completely pale with fright, while the children scream in amazement at the demonstration. Tyria is also amazed by her husband's precision, placing her hands on her chest in a gesture of pure admiration. Faced with the perplexed stares of everyone around him, Elric begins to sweat nervously, wondering internally if he should have pretended to be a little worse at throwing so as not to scare anyone. Noticing the frightened looks, Elric laughs nervously and decides to pretend it was pure luck to avoid embarrassment. Far from being frightened, Tyria clasps her hands in wonder and praises her husband, saying he looked like a knight. With a gentle smile, the boy notices that the girl was very cheerful and reflects that her joy must be due to the festive atmosphere. At that moment, the stall vendor extends his hand and hands over the prize well-deserved by the nobleman's victory. The smiling man explains that it was a package of eggs prepared by the merchants as a gift for the winners. Satisfied with the fun, Elric refuses the prize and asks the vendor to give it to the children, who are jumping for joy. Tyria observes her husband's attitude with a very affectionate gaze and praises him once again for being kind to everyone. The warrior fondly confesses that he too used to receive these packages and was overjoyed to find a rare golden egg inside. Laughing heartily, the young woman recalls that the boy traded the egg for a helmet so large it looked like a bucket on his head. Elric's eyes widened in surprise, and he asked how she knew such an old story from his youth. The noblewoman stammered, sweating profusely, and invented the excuse that rumors about his escapades were spreading throughout the region. With flushed cheeks, the girl desperately thinks that she could never tell her husband the truth. In her mind, Tyria remembers spending her days spying on the boy from afar, dreaming since that time of being his wife. The noblewoman is startled from her romantic reverie when her husband suddenly calls her. Under the light of dusk, the young man extends his hand and chivalrously invites her to go to the square to enjoy the festivities. Overflowing with happiness, Tyria firmly holds the warrior's hand and accepts the invitation with a beautiful smile. Night falls, and the residents gather in the square, where a man with a torch announces the start of the lighting ceremony. The man thanked the Lord for his presence and praised the beauty of his mistress, which further enhanced the festive event. While the crowd laughs, Tyria blushes slightly, and Elric comments, amused, that the fellow was quite a character. With a sweeping gesture, the leader invites the villagers to pray together for the glory and prosperity of the lands of Wibben. However, the man surprises everyone by pointing to the couple and declaring that the ceremony will be sealed with a kiss from them. The unusual statement catches Tyria off guard while Elric turns away, sweating profusely and panicked by the situation. The young woman's face burned with shame, paralyzed as she realized they were being asked to kiss in front of everyone. The entertainer holds the lit torch and keeps the attention of the entire square focused on the frightened noble couple. With an encouraging smile, he reinforces that this gesture of love would be the greatest symbol to bless the future of the land. The man points to the two again and formalizes the people's request for the lord and the lady to kiss right there. Elric and Tyria remain frozen, with the young woman on the verge of exploding with embarrassment under the immense pressure from the crowd. Gritting his teeth, the boy realizes that the cheeky entertainer was Bart, taking the opportunity to tease him about the delay. Laughing loudly, Bart incites the crowd, urging them to make noise to help the Lord find the courage he lacks. All the villagers begin shouting, demanding the kiss, leaving Elric with no way out while his wife hides her nervousness. Seeing that they would not escape, the warrior faces the blushing young woman and excuses himself in a surprisingly serious tone. Without warning, the mercenary holds his wife's waist and leans her back in a romantic and elegant movement under the moonlight. The young man's face draws closer to the young woman, whose eyes widen as his warm breath brushes against her skin. However, the Lord only whispers an apology, suggesting they pretend to give the kiss to appease the people. Tyria closes her eyes with a calm expression and says she understands his motivations, but then quickly interrupts herself. In a burst of courage, the noblewoman holds the warrior's face and pulls him into a real kiss without any pretense. Upon witnessing the passionate kiss, the villagers go wild as a large bonfire is lit to crown the event. Under the sky illuminated by the sparks of the bonfire, the crowd wishes that the young couple's love would last for all eternity. Later that night, the quiet Portman mansion lay peacefully, oblivious to the intense bustle of the village. Inside her room, Tyria sat on the bed, regretting her own audacity, muffling her screams in a pillow. The young woman lifts her face from the pillow, tears streaming down her cheeks, in a state of pure panic about her actions. The memory of the kiss floods her mind, making the noblewoman wonder in terror what she had done to her husband. Behind the door, she fears Elric will find her a strange woman and completely loses sleep on the night of the festival. In the other room, the sword-wielding demon touched his lips, his face burning, unable to sleep, his heart racing. Far from there, the scene changes the following day to the imposing facilities of the white residence in the kingdom of Armin. Inside the exquisite room, a mysterious man delicately holds a luxurious teacup. The blond man with glasses takes a sip of his hot drink with a rather serene and calculating posture in his office. A platinum-haired woman reports to her boss that the enemy army had broken through the defense lines on Chevor's borders. Edward sets his cup on the saucer and remarks that the defenses have crumbled since Kasha abandoned the battlefield. With a malicious smile, the influential Duke reflects that making the mercenary the primary target had been brilliant. Platinum-haired Secretary Agnes Blackmire silently observes the conversation from beside a masked woman. Agnes questions whether the leader would let the borders fall when those regions held the group's territory. Edward takes a sip of tea and explains that the war had only lasted a long time thanks to Kasha's efforts. The president added that the attacked regions no longer had any means to pay their debts. With the hero gone, the defenses would soon collapse, and all they needed to do was rescue the personnel and regain control of the operation. The man finishes his drink and calmly places the elegant cup on the large desk in the luxurious office. Agnes serves the president more tea and calls him ruthless for making such cold business decisions. The boss is embarrassed by the comment and defends himself by saying that he was only doing his duty as a nobleman. Ignoring her boss's outburst, the secretary changes the subject and asks if it wouldn't be a mistake to leave Kasha alive. Edward gives a knowing smile and corrects her, reminding her that the man had now assumed the name Elric Portman. The woman insists on the danger of retaliation, but the blond man trembles, imagining that failing in an attack would be fatal. He recalls, horrified, how the warrior managed to block a supersonic blast using a mana shield. The Duke calms the nerves and states that killing the boy would be a huge waste for the group's plans. The president explains that, although Elric was a mercenary like himself, there was a big difference between them. Edward raises his finger and reveals that the hero was not acting in pursuit of personal gain, which was rare in the profession. With an ambitious look, the man declares that he has decided to keep such a skilled guy completely under his control. Without Kasha in the war, the kingdoms would despair and beg for funds at the door of the Great White Company. The Platinum Blonde finally understands that Kasha would be the company's trump card in manipulating the course of the war. The president is overjoyed to see that his loyal secretary had understood his brilliant move. Edward points at the woman in a burst of excitement, praising the employee's absurd intelligence. The love-struck Duke completely loses his formal composure and steps forward to give Agnes a big hug. However, the reckless boss receives a brutal blow to the face before he even manages to touch the Platinum Blonde. Agnes coldly warns that she will not tolerate any antics that would involve knocking the young boss to the floor of the luxurious office. Far away, the region's grand train station receives the warm rays of sunshine on that beautiful, bustling morning. At the Portman mansion, young Elric tries on an elegant suit, while Rhonda asks if the outfit looks good. The warrior tries to talk to the housekeeper but freezes completely when he sees his young wife entering the room. Tyria's face turns intensely red with embarrassment, and she stammers as she calls her husband by his formal title. Still shaken by the events of the previous night, the mercenary also blushes violently as he greets the girl. Sensing the tense and awkward atmosphere between the couple, the housekeeper steps forward and politely breaks the silence. With a knowing smile, the old employee hurries off, leaving the two alone in the room. The young man scratches his neck, sweating profusely, as he watches the bespectacled woman strategically escape down the hallway. Rhonda peeks through the crack in the door and asks, confused, if they had argued after the heated atmosphere at the festival. Elric despairs and shouts that it was Bart's fault, while the housekeeper playfully confirms the steamy part. Trying to hide his own embarrassment, the young master changes the subject and asks about the day's guests. The housekeeper adjusts her glasses and explains that a trade delegation from the Western Kingdoms was about to arrive. Elric's red eyes widened with tension at the mention of the kingdoms on the western side of the map. Rhonda rejoices that the valuable wheat of Wibben had attracted delegations and even the coveted kingdom of Armin. The sword demon panics, fearing he will be recognized by old war enemies during the meeting. Rhonda claims that the boss would do that, but the master agrees that it was his duty to lead the negotiations from then on. Later, at the imposing train station, the butler Aldio tries to calm the nerves of the apprehensive young master. The old employee assures that everything will be fine if the boy will only follow the greetings he taught him. Elric takes a deep breath, trying to convince himself that no frontline warrior would show up to buy wheat. The war veteran touches the dagger hidden in his coat, promising that there would be no reason to use it there. A loud noise echoes through the grand station, announcing the arrival of the luxurious locomotive carrying the guests. The train doors open, and a large man steps onto the station platform with very firm steps. Leaning on his cane, the leader of the Portman family makes a small bow and welcomes the wealthy merchants. The young man continues his rehearsed speech, but suddenly freezes completely upon seeing the newcomer's face. The delegation leader trembles with fear and begins to sweat profusely before the patriarch of Wibben's wealthy family. The deadly and terrifying gaze of the sword-wielding demon gleams, confirming the young mercenary's worst nightmare. Trembling from head to toe, the supposed merchant points his finger and shouts, asking if that man was Kasha. Far away in the great kingdom of Armin, a man listens in bewilderment to the announcement of an unexpected visitor. President Edward runs desperately through the corridors alongside Agnes, grumbling about his sister's visit. Without wasting any time, the blond man forcefully throws open the large wooden doors of the luxurious salon. Overflowing with joy, the boss opens his arms and shouts Sister Egret's name to welcome her. However, the boy's enthusiasm is met only with a deadly and furious glare from the red-haired girl. An irritated Valentina was the majority shareholder of the group and sat waiting for her brother with her arms crossed in the office. Ignoring her anger, Edward lifts the girl up like a child and rejoices that she has grown so much. The young woman loses her temper and threatens to incinerate the boy if he doesn't put her down immediately. Terrified by his sister's fury, the president stammers and agrees to release her immediately. Valentina crosses her arms and demands to know if the blond man had finally discovered the whereabouts of the hero Kasha. The president scratches the back of his neck, sweating profusely, and tries to explain that the mercenary was like a ghost, difficult to track down. The girl grabbed his collar, threatening to withdraw all her company shares if he didn't find the warrior. She forcefully tugs at Edward's cheek, ordering him to bring the swordsman to her at any cost. After the fit of rage, the girl turns her back, elegantly swaying her long, dark cloak. With one last, terrifying look, she reinforces her order to her frightened brother. Valentina warns that there wouldn't be much time, demanding at least the target's location, while the blond man agrees. The young shareholder leaves the office, marching with firm steps, and slams the heavy doors shut violently. Agnes asks if the boss would really reveal their whereabouts, but he denies it, fearing the disaster of such a meeting. Changing the subject quickly, Edward asks the secretary if the trade delegation had already left for Wibben. The woman confirms the shipment, but doubts that a warrior like Kasha would fall for the bait of a simple negotiation. With a sinister smile, the president assures Elric that he has no choice, as he has prepared an offer he can't refuse. The scene cuts to the interior, revealing the delegation's train cutting through the region's vast wheat fields. Inside the vehicle, the frightened Lord Polo was sweating profusely, staring at his business partner in the cabin. The delegates remain seated in silence, awaiting the end of the long journey to the lands of Wibben. The experienced representative of the delegation maintains a serious and unwavering expression throughout the journey. The luxurious steam locomotive finally arrives at its destination, parking at the city's grand station. The train doors open, and the important merchants begin to disembark onto the illuminated platform. Elric and the butler make a formal bow, welcoming the distinguished visitors of the entourage. The young master begins his speech but freezes completely upon recognizing the face of one of the guests. Lord Polo also trembles with terror upon encountering the dreaded warrior in the middle of the station. Elric's murderous gaze gleams, confirming the old nobleman's worst nightmare. Trembling and sweating profusely, the cowardly Lord Polo recoils, shocked by the presence of the mercenary Kasha. The old man panics, clutching his partner, while Elric mentally despairs over the disastrous encounter. The young man understands that Wibben would be in danger if his identity were leaked, and vows to hide the truth at all costs. Polo ignores his teammates' pleas for calm and shouts, demanding that the train from that halfway point return immediately. Forcing a silly, awkward smile, Elric interrupts the outburst by introducing himself as the friendly Lord Portman. The old merchant is very confused by the pathetic posture, wondering to himself if that man isn't Kasha. The boy laughs, asking if Polo is all right, and the nobleman concludes that the hero would never act like an idiot. The man tries to recall the lethal aura of the sword-wielding demon he knew in the past to compare it with the Lord. Suddenly, the dark-haired young man from the delegation steps forward and delivers a brutal slap to Lord Polo's face. The old man falls to the ground before everyone while the assailant stares coldly at him amidst the murmurs of the crowd. The crowd on the platform begins to whisper in shock at the unexpected aggression between the guests. Lying on the ground, Polo shouts furiously, asking how a commoner dared to commit such insolence against him. The young man with red eyes calmly removes his glove and questions the old man's audacity in insulting his family. Without saying anything more, the boy throws the glove forcefully directly into the face of the arrogant merchant lord. The mysterious young man firmly declares that this offense to his honor will be resolved through a duel. Seething with hatred, Polo accepts the insolent boy's challenge and shouts for the guards to bring the swords. At that moment, a white-haired knight arrived in a wheelchair, shouting for them to stop. The young man with red eyes turns his face away, and Polo also focuses his attention on the newcomer, interrupting the fight. The wounded man begs Polo for forgiveness for his companion's offense, but the old man warns that it is already too late. The old merchant shouted, demanding that the supposed mercenary lower his head and apologize to him immediately. Trembling violently, he declares that the dreaded sword demon was a name that should never be uttered. The red-eyed youth stares at him as Polo recalls the monstrous creature from the battlefields. Realizing that the Lord was being too peaceful, the old man sighed in relief, thinking he had overreacted. Polo mutters irritably that Kasha's ghost still haunts him while Elric forces a weak smile. The merchant glanced sideways at the Lord, who continued to sweat profusely to disguise his nervousness. After the misunderstanding, the group travels comfortably by carriage towards the property under the sunset. The luxury vehicle finally approaches the grand doors of the Portman mansion in the late afternoon. Tyria and the maids wait patiently in the drawing room to receive the arrival of the distinguished visitors. The beautiful young woman formally introduces herself as the lady of the house, displaying a kind and charming smile. Concerned about their fatigue, the noblewoman politely suggests that the merchants rest from their journey first. Housekeeper Rhonda takes the lead and carefully guides the delegation to their comfortable quarters. Night finally falls over the Wibben lands, covering the silent mansion with a starry sky. In his room, Polo hears knocking on the door and, sprawled in his armchair, asks if it's room service. Without waiting for an answer, someone enters the room with slow, heavy steps. The shopkeeper gets annoyed and says that nothing was needed, demanding not to be disturbed during his rest. Elric appears before the old man with a deadly look, coldly warning that he will need to disturb him a little. Completely terrified, the merchant's legs give way and he falls seated on the floor of the room. Polo points with a trembling finger and affirms that that murderous look confirmed that the Lord was indeed Kasha. The old man's terrified scream echoes, muffled by the grand facade of the moonlit property. Facing the fallen man, the warrior rests his hands on his cane and declares that he will hide nothing more. Polo crawls backward, stammering that he had already apologized for what happened that day at the station. The mercenary sits calmly in the armchair and asks if he was referring to the day of the insult to the family. With a merciless expression, Elric warns that he doesn't remember accepting the old merchant's apologies. The young man asks if Polo planned to remain lying on the ground, inviting him to discuss business. The young master intimidatingly questions whether the old man had traveled all the way there just to buy wheat. The two finally sit face to face at the small table in the room to begin the dreaded negotiation. The cowardly merchant swallowed hard, feeling the immense pressure of standing before the ruthless warrior. Elric takes the initiative, revealing that before coming to Wibben, he had met with Lord Ugal. The old man is surprised and asks what was discussed, while the Lord replies that he made a very good offer. The young man explains that Ugal intended to buy absolutely all the wheat stock from Wibben's lands. Polo smiles, confirming that the merchandise would be distributed throughout the western region by the Kingdom of Armen. Sliding a coin across the table, Elric proposes that a portion of the commissions go to his family. The old man raises his finger and imposes the sole condition that the sale be made exclusively to them. The merchant confidently hoped that the Lord would make a wise decision for the future of his house. Displaying a greedy grin, Polo calls the boy by his formal title, believing he is in control. Suddenly, the old man slammed his hands on the table forcefully, cursing the Kingdom of Armen with pure hatred. Polo yells angrily when he realizes his competitors have been plotting behind his back all along. Taking advantage of the opening, Elric peacefully suggests that the merchant close the big deal with him. The warrior agrees to sell the stock on the condition that Polo matches Armen's offer. The old man clenches his fists and explains that, being merely a supply officer, he couldn't set prices. Elric plays dirty and suggests that accepting his apology was the condition for making peace between them. Polo stares at the boy in silence, realizing he was being pressed against the wall. Trying to escape, the merchant begs for a price adjustment to 60% of the initial offer. The old man's face hardened intensely, showing that the negotiation had reached its absolute breaking point. Desperate, he increases the offer to 70%, guaranteeing that the Empire would cover the shipping. Elric coldly retorted, demanding 75% under the same transport conditions. With no other options, the merchant shakes the young master's hand, accepting the bitter agreement. The two stand up, sealing the contract, and Elric congratulates him for being the first to close a deal with the Empire. Still suspicious, the experienced negotiator asks the real reason why the Lord chose him in particular. Elric faces the old merchant and mentally reveals that he chose him simply because he seemed like the easiest target. The warrior keeps this thought to himself and smiles, saying it's a great chance for redemption. Tilting his head slightly, the boy announces that he has a very important request to make of Polo. The old man's eyes widened in shock as he heard the Lord warn about the rumors of Kasha in the lands of Wibben. With a deadly gaze, Elric vows that their contract will be rewritten in blood should his identity be revealed. Completely terrified, the merchant swallows hard and sweats coldly, fully understanding the deadly threat. The following day, the delegation gathers around a large table with Tyria and Elric leading the negotiations. The young lady formally announces that the Portman family will enter into a commercial agreement with the Imperial Army. The young man claps his hands with a satisfied smile, supporting his wife's wise decision in front of everyone. Armen's purple-haired delegate congratulates Polo, who thanks him for his kindness, still a little nervous about everything. Suddenly, a violent slap on the table completely shatters the polite and formal atmosphere of the luxurious establishment. Armen's representative stands up furiously and questions whether Tyria had discussed the matter with the Lord. He continues shouting, calling the girl lady, until Elric interrupts him, demanding he call her madam. Armen's delegate freezes instantly, taken aback by the young warrior's curt correction. Standing beside her husband, Tyria proudly declares that her name is Tyria Portman, wife of the Lord. She glares at the man and states that it's incredibly rude for a police officer to get her title wrong. Sweating profusely under the young woman's pressure, the merchant swallows his pride and apologizes, addressing her as ma'am. Polo covers his mouth to disguise a laugh, relishing seeing his arrogant rival humiliated like that. Elric lets out a soft sigh of relief, very proud of the firm posture his beautiful wife displayed at the table. He discreetly removes his hand from the hilt of the hidden dagger, realizing that he wouldn't need to resolve the situation with force. Later, Elric accompanies the guests to the carriage and orders the guards to escort them safely. Through the car window, Polo waves his prized contract in hand, beaming with happiness at the great deal. The sword demon watches the delegation depart, maintaining a remarkably serene expression on his face. The couple stood side by side on the dirt path, watching the carriage drive away towards the mountains. Elric turns to his wife with a smile and confesses that he was surprised to see such a resolute side to her. Tyria closes her eyes calmly and replies very naturally that she only told the truth to that man. Then she praises her husband's shrewdness, leaving the warrior somewhat confused by the sudden comment. The girl shows the contract given by Polo and explains that the actual terms were very favorable to them. Elric laughs and confesses that he only changed his speech to strike a blow at the pride of Armin's envoy, who had been very rude. With the negotiations finally resolved, the young master suggests they go back inside, and Tyria agrees. The scene changes to a flag bearing the financial group's letters waving under a beautiful cloudy sky. The flag belonged to Edward White's grand and luxurious private residence in the center of the kingdom. Inside, a desperate cry echoes through the immense, ornate corridors of the exquisite and expensive palace. Edward runs through the halls, tearing at his own hair and screaming in pure frustration at the Lord's refusal. The young president cries uncontrollably to Agnes, grumbling that he had made an offer he couldn't refuse for the wheat. Making a scene, he grumbles that Elric only needed to have accepted the offer and become rich by following the plan. The blond man throws himself to the ground in a fit of rage, shouting the mercenary's name and complaining about having his plans ruined. The president's childish tantrum is abruptly interrupted when a shoe stomps hard on him. The impact sends the young tycoon flying into the air in a comical and highly unexpected scene in the middle of the hall. Before he falls face first to the ground, a mysterious hand firmly grabs his wrist with considerable force. Edward hangs in mid-air, completely stunned and confused by his secretary's sudden rescue. Agnes pulls him into a hug and presses the spoiled boss's face against her chest to calm him down. The force of the embrace causes them both to slide slightly across the polished floor of the hall until they come to a safe stop. The secretary scolds him and tells him to calm down immediately, while the blond man offers muffled apologies. Sometime later, a hot tea is served in a beautiful and elegant cup to calm the president's nerves. Agnes asks if he's calmer now, and Edward thanks her for her help, still a little shaken by the situation. Sitting at his desk, the blond man reflects that he never imagined Kashaw would be doing business with the Empire in the midst of a war. The woman suggests that the best way to discover someone's true intentions is to ask them directly. Edward stares at his teacup in silence and finally agrees that they had no choice but to question him. Determined to resolve things, the president grips a doorknob firmly, ready for his next move. The president reflects on the Lord's refusal and decides to change his approach with a new idea. Looking at a luxurious golden weapon, he concludes that he would need to use a good means of communication. The scene shifts to the grand and elegant mansion of the wealthy Elverse Graham family. The old merchant Polo visits the white-haired man who is in his wheelchair. The wounded nobleman holds a small, tied-up scroll and asks curiously what it is. Polo reveals that it was a letter sent specifically by Elric Portman to the Lord. The retired knight opens the paper, unrolls the letter calmly, and begins to read the message. He analyzes the content with a very serious expression, focusing on the words written in the document. The old merchant follows the reading, sweating profusely, and is very surprised by Graham's reaction. The nobleman covers his face with his hand and begins to laugh loudly, breaking the silence of the mansion. Graham laughs and comments that Polo must have almost fainted from fright when he came face to face with the terrifying Kashaw. Overjoyed, he thanks the merchant for having traveled all the way there just to deliver the letter. Polo bows, signaling his departure, while Graham wishes him a safe journey. Alone, the nobleman reflects on Kasha's mysterious disappearance and concludes that winter would soon arrive. Time passes, and the peaceful Wibbin farm ends up being overtaken by a snow-covered landscape. In the middle of the dense frozen forest, the barrel of a hunting rifle smokes after a well-aimed shot. A young hunter celebrates his excellent shot, while his companions enthusiastically congratulate him. The group of friends runs relieved toward the large deer that had been killed in the middle of the icy trail. While two of them examine the animal's body, the third member of the group notices a danger. Derek freezes in fear, his eyes wide, as his friend urges him to fetch the horses. The young hunter signals for silence to his companions, his face completely covered in sweat. Trembling violently, he gripped his spear and ordered the two idiots to get away from the prey immediately. The boy desperately warned that he could sense the murderous aura of a dangerous magical beast. The friend scoffs at the warning, thinking the sudden chill was just because of the harsh winter. Suddenly, the boys fall to the ground, terrified, when a creature attacks the dead deer in the snow. Derek points his rifle hastily and shouts for his companions to flee from mortal danger. The enormous snout of a giant, terrifying wolf emerges before the panicked hunters in the forest. The large monster with bright blue eyes roars fiercely, ready to devour the humans there. Far from the forest, the imposing Portman mansion bravely withstands the intense cold of that winter. Tyria listens to the horrifying account and deeply regrets that something so terrible has happened. The three young hunters kneel, wounded, before the woman, confessing that they fled in panic. The understanding noblewoman asks them to have some hot tea while she resolves the big problem. The young wife calls the housekeeper Rhonda and orders that the boys be well fed in the mansion. Later, the butler Aldio carefully leafs through the thick pages of a book of monsters. Walking through the library, the old man compares the hunter's account with the data from the encyclopedia. The experienced employee concludes that the fearsome beast in the forest was a wolf of blades. Tyria clenched her hands, worried about the presence of such a great danger lurking around her property. The butler recalls that the former leader of these monsters was responsible for injuring the late lord. Focused on protecting the people, the young woman displays a serious and fearless gaze in the face of the grave threat. The lady of the house declares firmly that she would organize a subjugation squad immediately. Aldio supports his boss's decision and assures her that he would recruit the best elite hunters in the region. However, the noblewoman summons the experienced butler, changing her tone of voice to make one last request. She puts her finger to her lips and asks the experienced servant to hide all of that from the lord. The man is very confused by the sudden order, but nods in agreement to keep the big secret. Sometime later, a carriage awaits the young noblewoman outside in freezing weather. Elric watches his wife leave with a loving smile, wishing her a very safe journey. Accompanied by Aldio, the girl walks across the snowy field towards the transport vehicle. The old man fears that hiding the problem would hurt the lord's feelings when the truth came out. Tyria's gaze becomes melancholic, fearing that he might risk it again as he had in the past. Her mind retrieves the memory of little Elric stepping in front of her to save her from the dogs. The memory brings back images of young Elric confronting the giant wolf with a stick. The butler states that they themselves should resolve the problem so as not to put the lord in danger. The old official explains that he has already recruited the best elite hunters in that region. The young woman agrees and begins to walk, surprising the butler, who notices she will be walking along. Tyria firmly states that accompanying the hunters was her absolute duty as a noblewoman. Aldio understands the weight of the decision, but begs her to back down should a magical beast appear. Far away, the bustling commercial district of Wibben remained covered in thick winter snow. The village's tranquility is focused on the snow-covered wooden facade of the old town hospital. Inside, an old doctor examines Elric's knee, informing him that it is almost healed. The warrior rises excitedly upon hearing the news, but the doctor advises him to continue using his cane. The doctor changes the subject and asks, concerned, if the enormous scar on his neck still hurts. The boy rubs the back of his neck with a smile and praises the skill of the excellent doctor who treated him. The old man remembers how difficult that treatment was because the wolf's fangs caused frostbite. Elric's eyes widened in complete shock upon hearing that his own father had begged for his life. The doctor laughs, recalling that it was the first time he had seen the late lord cry from sheer terror. The image of the stern patriarch comes to the boy's mind, who confesses that it is very difficult to imagine. The doctor bids farewell to the young master, asking him not to exert himself too much for a few days. The heavy wooden doors of the medical clinic open quietly to the outside. Elric walks calmly down the snowy street, closely followed by one of his guards. The sword demon stops walking and turns his face away in surprise upon hearing someone call his name. The nobleman recognizes the bearded man in armor immediately upon hearing the name Luton. The old childhood friend broke into a huge smile, confirming that the captain had indeed returned. The two celebrate their reunion with a warm hug, overjoyed after so many years apart. Luton proudly displays the sword he received from the court, proving that he was now a royal knight. Excited about the news, Elric promises to buy drinks so they can catch up. Suddenly, a messenger appears running down the street, shouting and carrying an urgent letter. The breathless man extends the parchment, announcing that it was a ransom demand for the Portmans. The Lord's eyes widened in panic, and he demanded to know what was happening in his house. The messenger hesitates for a moment, sweating profusely, and mentions the name of Mrs. Tyria Portman. Elric's face takes on a grim expression upon discovering that his wife had been attacked. The story cuts to the dense and dangerous frozen forest where gunshots echo through the high mountains. Two enormous wolves with gleaming eyes run fiercely through the snow, hunting the forest invaders. One of the skilled snipers aims and fires his weapon with precision at the beasts. The powerful, swift shot strikes one of the monsters squarely in the head, spurting blood onto the snow. The snipers cover the rear while the young noblewoman flees hastily, accompanied by her maid. Little Marie points desperately to an old, abandoned wooden cabin in the middle of the woods. Following the soldiers' orders, the two girls run terrified to take shelter in the dark house. Outside, the archers shatter bright magical stones, creating an immense flash of light. The brave hunters dart in the opposite direction, using the glow to lure the monsters away. The plan works, and a large pack of beasts advances swiftly, chasing the glow of magic. Inside the dark cabin, Tyria and Marie huddle together, embracing each other under a blanket, trembling with pure fear. The noblewoman cries, apologizing for the danger, but the maid says she chose to follow her willingly. Trying to stay strong, Marie promises that the rescue team will soon arrive to save them from that nightmare. Tyria displays a sad smile, relieved that she had hidden that from her husband to keep him safe. The young maid can't bear the pressure and bursts into tears, moved by her mistress's kindness. Far away, the Lord and his faithful friend ride desperately across the mountains at high speed. The mercenary blames himself during the ride, wondering if he was so untrustworthy that she ran away. Luton senses Elric's desperation and demands that he remain calm, promising to save the girl soon. The young warrior nods in agreement and thanks his childhood best friend for his loyal support. A memory shows little Luton running in fright alongside young Tyria, who is calling for her friend. The memory of the past brings back young Elric as he faces the fearsome giant wolf alone. Little Luton runs off crying in terror, promising to fetch reinforcements to help the captain. Back in the present, Luton rides off, vowing that he would never again leave his friend to fight alone. In the midst of the intense snowstorm, the two finally find the search team waving. Elric and Luton jump off their horses and rush towards the farm guards. The warrior desperately asks about his wife, and the soldier points to the old hut. The guard warns that his companions lured the beasts away and left them isolated. Without hesitation, Elric asks to be guided there, determined to save the men in danger. Luton grabs his friend's shoulder and stops him from advancing, taking control of the situation. The knight announces that he will rescue the team and orders the warrior to go protect his own wife. With a confident smile, Luton assures everyone that he is no longer the cowardly little boy he once was. Elric calms down and gives a proud smile, agreeing that his friend was now a knight. Without wasting any time, Luton orders the hunters to show the way and rushes into combat. Alone in the snow, the young lord realizes he needs to hurry to find the girl. The sword demon runs desperately, cutting through the dangerous forest frozen by winter. His footsteps sink into the thick snow as he hurries across the difficult terrain. Frustrated by the speed of the beasts, he prays that everyone there is safe and sound. After running for quite a while, the boy finally spots the wooden cabin just ahead. Elric bursts open the heavy door of the dark cottage, breathless and anxious to find his wife. With his heart racing, the warrior shouts Tyria's name, echoing through the small hut. The girl and the maid are startled by his arrival, asking the reason for his visit. Relieved to find them safe, the boy walks briskly across the wooden floor. Without saying a word, he pulls Tyria into a tight hug, surprising the young noblewoman. With her face flushed, the girl stammers and asks why he went to such a dangerous place. The warrior tightens his embrace, holding his wife with great affection and pure protective instinct. Annoyed, he scolds her, saying she should never make such dangerous decisions on her own. Tyria looks at him with tear-filled eyes, explaining that she didn't want to put him at risk. The young man is a little hurt, and wonders if his wife had so little confidence in his abilities. The noblewoman hugs him back tightly and explains, her face flushed, that it wasn't anything like that. Elric buries his face in her shoulder and begs the young woman to promise never to take risks again. Tyria closes her eyes with a sweet smile and vows she won't do it again. Young Marie watches the scene with a silly smile, relieved to see the love between the beautiful couple. Suddenly, heavy footsteps echoed outside, making the warrior look back on high alert. The maid excitedly rejoices, announcing that the brave hunters had returned. Elric smiles contentedly and praises the extermination group's hard work. However, the Lord's expression quickly changes when he notices that someone is missing from the group. Worried, the warrior immediately asked where his friend Luton had gone. One of the guards explains tensely that the knight ordered their retreat and stayed behind to fight alone. Elric slaps his own forehead, cursing his friend for trying to play the great hero. Determined to act, the Lord orders the girls to be taken away, for he would return to save Luton. As the boy turns to break, a delicate hand firmly grips the sleeve of his coat. The warrior looks back in surprise, seeing his wife holding him with a distressed look. Tyria cries, terrified, and begs her husband to promise to return safely to her. The girl refuses to let go of his clothes, trembling before the great danger in the dark forest. She confesses to being terrified at the idea of losing him and again asks for his promise to return. Elric holds his wife's cold hands and gently asks her to simply trust him. With a passionate look, he vows to bring the knight back and return safely. The young master slowly releases the girl's hand, preparing for the imminent combat in the snow. Tearfully, Tyria warns that she would never forgive him if he broke that vital promise. The warrior smiles, closing his eyes, and accepts her condition before setting off for battle. The beast advances through the snow, its sharp claws ready for a deadly strike. Luton raises his sword and prepares to receive the attack of the wolf leaping towards him. With a precise movement, the knight rips the beast's belly in two in a brutal blow. Completely exhausted and bleeding heavily, the young man tries to catch his breath in the middle of the blizzard. The situation worsens when a huge pack of wolves appears, surrounding the wounded knight. Luton let out a laugh of pure despair, not expecting to find so many magical beasts there. His face covered in blood, he clenches his teeth, struggling to stay upright in the snow. Surrounded on all sides, he realizes that his vision is blurring due to blood loss. The knight shouts with all his might, accepting that he would die fighting in his homeland. Too weak even to lift his weapon, he is confused, wondering why the wolves didn't attack. One of the enormous monsters lets out a terrifying growl, opening its mouth full of teeth. The magical beast charges swiftly toward the defenseless knight in the middle of the frozen field. The wolf's fangs stop inches from Luton's face in a swift and precise attack. However, a powerful luminous blast pierced the monster's chest before it could devour him. The knight opened his eyes in astonishment, wondering if the hunters had returned to help him. Elric appears holding a rifle and jokingly says that his friend looked terrible for a royal knight. The Lord throws the weapon to the ground, admitting it wasn't his style, while confirming that his wife was all right. Facing the ferocious monsters, Elric turns to his wounded friend and asks him for a great favor. The young master extends his hand and asks to borrow the royal knight's sword. The mercenary walks calmly, stopping right in front of the immense pack of wolves. Luton readily hands over his weapon, stating that he would give his own life if the captain asked. The friend warns that the real sword was much heavier than the wooden training sword. Ignoring the warning, Elric spins the weapon with extreme ease and lightness, using only one hand. The warrior glances over his shoulder, remembering that his friend wanted to know about his past. With a deadly look, the sword-wielding demon said he would show everything he had learned. The wild beasts growl and charge forward, ready to devour the noble intruder. Elric concentrates an immense sphere of brilliant mana, knowing that the beasts were sensitive to it. The monsters react to the strong magical energy and howl fiercely at the illuminated target. The entire pack runs frantically toward the boy wielding the magic-charged blade. In the blink of an eye, Elric advances, raising a large cloud of snow on the battlefield. The warrior tears one of the wolves apart in a swift blow, releasing electric shocks from his weapon. With monstrous strength, he cuts another magical beast in mid-air, splattering blood across the snow. Luton watches in shock as the captain massacres the pack with utterly absurd skill. The knight remembers the weak boy from the past, realizing that this man was a monster. Elric continues his relentless massacre, slicing up the beasts that tried to attack him from all sides. With a cold, focused gaze, the warrior swings his sword, annihilating his enemies effortlessly. The sword demon dances through the snow, leaving a trail of blood and corpses in its wake. Standing calmly in the middle of the pack, he surveys the last surviving wolves with disdain. Elric raises his weapon to the sky, releasing an absurd amount of blue energy. Pure, destructive mana shines intensely, preparing a devastating attack against the beasts. The Lord plunges his sword into the snow, creating a shock wave that annihilates all the monsters. Luton's eyes widened, and his mouth dropped open, completely stunned by the bizarre scene. The young master turned around amidst the fallen bodies, asking his friend what he thought of it all. Displaying a proud smile, Elric asks if that massacre satisfied the knight's curiosity. Poor Luton falls seated in the snow, sweating profusely and processing the terrifying power of his lord. The knight honestly confessed that he was now even more confused than before he asked. The story moves to the old cabin, where Elric thanks his friend for everything he had done. All bandaged up and resting on the ground, the knight replies that he had hardly been of any help in the battle. The warrior states that he couldn't have done it alone, and takes the opportunity to ask Luton for one last favor. With a loyal smile, the friend says that the captain has already saved him twice and only needed to give the order. Elric smiles and asks his friend to take all the credit for the hunt, as he'd rather not draw any attention to himself. The Lord explains that he had his reasons and insists on the request, leaving the bandaged knight somewhat hesitant. Facing the sweating captain, the friend finally understands the situation and agrees to keep the big secret. The scene cuts to the central square where the crowd cheers enthusiastically, celebrating the knight Luton as the hero of Wibben. An old man praises the warrior, impressed by his courage in facing so many magical beasts completely alone. Extremely sweaty and nervous about the lie, the knight tries to disguise it and accepts the compliments in a rather awkward manner. Hidden amidst the large crowd, Elric smiles contentedly and gestures for silence to his companion. The fake hero watches the Lord from afar, sweating profusely and silently accepting the weight of that false title of glory. Laughing nervously, Luton claims he only drew his sword for Wibben's peace, while the Lord extols the knight's honor. The old man raises his arms excitedly and asks everyone to make a lot of noise to celebrate the great savior of the region. The crowd goes wild at the Lord's words and shouts excitedly, applauding the wounded warrior in the middle of the great square. Satisfied with the peaceful outcome of the situation, the young master turns his back smiling and decides it's time to go back. The story moves to the grand and imposing Portman mansion, covered in thick snow in the midst of a harsh winter. A luxurious carriage, pulled by 2 horses, approaches swiftly, crossing the white, frozen field of the farm. The large wooden wheels glide through the snow, and the vehicle finally parks in front of the family's property. The young master calmly descends from the carriage and walks towards his wife, who was waiting for him outside. With flushed cheeks, Tyria welcomes them and confesses that she was already worried about her husband's delay. The Lord smiles shyly and apologizes, explaining that he was only late to properly bid his friend farewell. The beautiful girl notices the way he walks and curiously asks if he no longer needs to use his cane. The warrior pats his own leg, reassuring himself that he is fine, despite the doctor's recommendation to avoid strenuous activity. Adopting a slightly more serious demeanor, the young man catches his wife's attention, leaving the young noblewoman quite surprised. With a very affectionate look, the sword demon begs her never to put herself in such a dangerous situation again. Tyria's face flushes with embarrassment at her husband's thoughtfulness, and she promises with a lovely smile that she will remember it. The couple walk side by side back inside the mansion, while the Lord remarks that it was very cold outside. Suddenly, the warrior gripped the doorframe tightly, revealing that he had been trying to hide the pain of an injury. Forcing a genuine smile, the young master politely asks the girl to step in front of him. Observing the couple's passionate mood, the housekeeper Rhonda jokingly says it felt like summer inside the mansion. Tyria sweetly thanks her husband for his chivalry, while the young man follows close behind her down the corridors. Completely unexpectedly, the young noblewoman loses her strength and almost faints, startling the lord, who shouts her name. The mercenary rushes forward, holding his unconscious wife in his arms, desperately pleading for her to wake up. The young lady is quickly taken to her rooms, where the housekeeper cares for her with great concern. The old village doctor finishes his examinations and informs the young master that her condition was worse than he had expected. The sword demon's eyes widened in complete terror upon hearing that the girl was in a very critical situation. With a somber expression, the doctor laments the situation, recalling that the boy's father had made the same face in the past. Despair grips the young man's heart as he grips the old doctor's arm tightly, sweating profusely. Boiling with agony, the Lord screams, begging the man to do the impossible to save his precious wife. The doctor lowers his head with a very serious posture and solemnly promises that he will do absolutely everything in his power. A carriage races desperately across the frozen plains, braving the heavy snowstorm under a dark, cloudy sky. Elric was breathing heavily, his expression extremely tired, until he was suddenly called by one of the housemaids. The young master falls seated on the icy floor of the property, completely desolate, while the maids rush to him. Little Marie stares at him with great pity, while the other employee asks the Lord to try to remain calm. The view through the mansion window shows the sorrowful warrior sitting completely alone at the large dining table. The boy stares at his plate of food with a blank, lifeless look, unable to do anything about the situation. A sweet voice asks if the food wasn't good, breaking the boy's trance, who looks up, clearly surprised. The radiant image of Tyria smiling affectionately emerges in the warrior's troubled mind as a harsh memory. The Lord lowered his head with a melancholy expression, remembering that the two had barely spoken in recent days. With a heavy heart, the young master reflects alone, wishing he could talk to his wife for just a little longer. The plate of food remains completely untouched on the table, cooling in a deep and agonizing silence. Housekeeper Rhonda and young Marie collect the meal, worried to notice that the Lord had eaten nothing. Marie holds the tray with a sad look until another maid runs desperately down the corridors calling for the Lord. A silver tray is removed from the table, the Lord's meal remaining completely untouched. Young Marie holds the tray with a very sad look, noting that her boss used to eat everything. The housekeeper approaches, worried, while the young man apologizes and confesses to having no appetite. Trying to cheer him up, Rhonda suggests that the two of them take a walk in the garden that his wife loves so much. The tour reveals a wonderful place filled with countless blue roses shimmering in the daylight. The warrior is captivated by her beauty, and the housekeeper explains that Tyria took care of everything with affection. The woman with glasses explains that the flowers bloomed in winter thanks to a combination of devotion and magic. With a nostalgic smile, she recalls that the young master also loved plants when he was a child. Elric sighed heavily, saying that his memories were already too weak and distant. The boy laments that his mind was dominated by the smell of blood and the sight of corpses. The housekeeper sits in the garden and recalls that Tyria dreamed of becoming a combat medic. The warrior is perplexed to discover his beloved wife's ancient and noble life goal. An old memory flashes through Elric's mind, showing childlike hands holding a small bag. Rhonda asks if the Lord is all right, and he hides his face, shaken by having forgotten the past. Feeling the icy wind, the housekeeper suggests they go back inside, and the young master agrees. The afternoon soon gives way to a beautiful sunset, illuminating the facade of the imposing Portman mansion. The Lord decides to visit the old office and finds Aldio completely surprised by his visit. The sword-wielding demon stares at the piles of papers and asks what the old butler was doing there. Aldio displays the numerous documents on the table, explaining that he had a lot of experience to take care of that. Seething with rage, Elric shouts that the old man should have helped Tyria before she collapsed from exhaustion. Maintaining his composure, the experienced butler explained that he was merely following his employer's orders. The young master lowers his head and asks if he can help, but the old man prefers to focus on his work. As the lord turns his back dejectedly, Aldio gently mentions that he would ask for tea to be brought to him. A short time later, Marie walks down the corridors pushing a tea cart very carefully. The girl knocks on the door with a determined look and enters as soon as the boss authorizes her entry. The maid finds the warrior sitting in the dark, his gaze filled with pure sadness. She approaches slowly, holding the teapot and showing great pity for the lonely lord. The young woman carefully pours the hot drink into a very beautiful and elegant porcelain cup. With a welcoming smile, Marie offers her mistress's beloved rose tea, trying to comfort the young man. Elric stares at the steaming drink with a very melancholic expression and thanks them for the thoughtful gesture. Sensing his pain, the girl asks the master not to lose hope because Tyria would get better. The warrior forces a weak smile and sincerely apologizes for causing everyone so much worry. Marie bows respectfully and explains that she only tried to cheer him up because he seemed downcast. The employee excuses herself and leaves hurriedly, closing the large wooden doors of the quiet room. Alone again, Elric leans back on the sofa and sighs, feeling an immense longing for his first love. Night finally falls over the lands of Wibben, with a huge full moon illuminating the cloudy sky. Far from the mansion, the cold punishes the facade of the old village hospital under the intense moonlight. Inside, a nurse jots down data on her clipboard while monitoring Tyria's terrible fever. The young noblewoman slowly opens her eyes and suffers, thinking that she shouldn't continue lying like that. Weeping from weakness, she squeezes her eyes shut, afraid that her husband would become ill from suffering so much. The attentive nurse notices the movement in the bed and asks, relieved, if the lady had woken up. However, the girl lacks the strength to answer and continues to suffer from fever, hearing her name being called. A luxurious carriage travels along snow-covered roads during winter. Tyria gets out of the vehicle, her boots stepping softly onto the white snow. The young woman smiles with relief upon arriving home and asks if everything went well in her absence. The maids of the mansion rush in, very happy to greet their mistress. Little Marie hugs Tyria, crying with longing, while the noblewoman comforts her tenderly. The housekeeper Zelda also expresses relief and vows to continue serving the lady with dedication. With flushed cheeks, Tyria wondered inwardly if her husband was all right. Suddenly, Elric bursts through the mansion doors, shouting desperately to find out if she was hurt. The girl's heart races with emotion upon seeing the warrior's genuine concern. The young master breathes heavily and becomes completely paralyzed as he stares at her safely. Without thinking twice, he rushes forward through the snow, calling out to his wife. The boy shouts with all his might, feeling immense relief at seeing her whole. He runs desperately towards the noblewoman who tries to calm him down amidst all the commotion. The warrior ignores her pleas and pulls her into an extremely tight and protective embrace. Tearfully, Elric begs for forgiveness and pleads with them to stay embraced like that. The starry night finally falls upon the quiet and peaceful Portman estate. In her room, Tyria rolls around on the bed, hugging a pillow in a true outburst of passion. The young woman cannot contain her overwhelming happiness as she recalls her husband's immense affection. The memory of the boy's tight, protective embrace returns to the girl's mind. She swings her legs on the bed, completely enchanted, swearing that her heart is going to explode. The romantic outburst is interrupted by light knocks on the large bedroom door. Little Marie excitedly bursts through the door, announcing that she has brought evening tea. Tyria gets a huge fright and shrinks back in bed, her face burning with pure shame. The noblewoman quickly regained her elegant posture and asked the employee to come inside. The maid agrees with a huge smile and enters the room with the tray. While having tea, Marie asks how the couple met and Tyria explains that circumstances prevented them from having a proper ceremony. Burning with curiosity, the girl leans across the table, wanting all the details of their first date. With a nostalgic smile, the wife reveals that the young man was incredibly brave and proposed to her right away. Marie is amazed by the Lord's audacity, while his mistress laments that he fled before hearing the answer. Despite their sudden escape, fate brought them together again that same autumn at the Portman estate. The story travels back in time, recalling the exact day when Baron Wibbon went to negotiate with the former head of the family. The gruesome scene depicts a wooden stick striking the palm of a hand with extreme violence. Little Tyria endures the physical punishment with outstretched hands, trying not to cry in pain. A stern and merciless woman brandishes a weapon, punishing the little girl without a shred of pity. A maid tries to interrupt the punishment, fearing that someone in the house would see it, but is quickly told to shut up. The cruel noblewoman glares at the child and calls her name in an extremely menacing voice. She makes it clear that the girl's marriage would decide the family's future, stating that the union with the Namruds would be perfect. The matriarch threatened to leave the little girl without food for an entire month if she dared to complain about that arrangement one more time. After the unjust punishment, the woman turns her back and marches out, slamming the large double doors shut in fury. The employee hugs the poor weeping child and promises to quickly fetch medicine to ease her pain. The woman hurries down the long corridor, leaving the little girl completely alone in the middle of the luxurious hall. Tyria clutches her small, wounded hands and lowers her face, feeling immense sadness and loneliness. Tears streaming down her face. The girl wonders why she was forced to marry a man she didn't even know. The crying is interrupted when a large book falls onto the carpet, startling the girl as a boy's hands try to catch it. Little Elric freezes, crouching on the ground, realizing he had been caught spying on the young noblewoman's suffering. Completely embarrassed, the boy stands up and awkwardly waves, greeting the girl on their reunion. Tyria wipes away her tears, asking what he was doing there, and the boy explains that he lived in the house, also noticing that she could speak. Ignoring formalities, the curious young heir gets straight to the point and asks who she would be forced to marry. The girl lowers her head with a melancholic look, explaining that she would only accept that sad fate to save her family. Hearing the story, little Elric steps forward with a confident posture and offers his help to solve her problem. Young Elric adopts a confident stance and asks the girl to accompany him, promising to prevent the arranged marriage. Tyria is completely surprised by the little boy's protective attitude and blushes slightly. Back in the present, Marie is overcome with excitement, wanting to know where the young master has taken her. The maid leans over excitedly, demanding to know the exact location of the meeting. The story flashes back to the past, showing two village boys marveling at Tyria's beauty. Little Elric smiles proudly, confirming to his friends that he wasn't lying about the girl. One of the boys teases Elric, saying he had been rejected by his fiancée, and the boy shouts angrily. Tyria lets out a suppressed laugh behind her parasol while the young master argues with his friends. Trying to disguise his true intentions, Elric invents a story that his grand plan was to recruit a beautiful doctor for their group. The two friends shake their heads negatively, not believing the leader's flimsy excuse. The boy excitedly shouts for his squad to begin inspecting the territory. Later, the little leader and the girl walk alone in a quiet atmosphere through the fields. Elric breaks the silence by explaining some military laws concerning the Empire's soldiers. He states that she was now officially the unit's doctor and no longer needed to worry. Burning with embarrassment, the boy asks if he would hear the answer to the marriage proposal if he became a knight. In the present moment, Marie cries out in delight, noticing that the young master was determined to win her over completely. With a nostalgic smile, Tyria laments that relatives showed up and prevented her from giving a proper response. Returning to the memory, the group of children walks happily through the mountains all day long. The walk is interrupted when a small magical squirrel appears, holding a nut in the path. The boys run desperately and excitedly, trying to capture the small creature in the forest. In the mansion, Tyria smiles, remembering how her days have become more enjoyable thanks to the young lord. In the past, Elric excitedly points out his clan's grand hideout to the girl. The young noblewoman gazes in wonder at the immense wooden cabin built in the middle of the forest. The boy smiles confidently, promising to build a training center there when he becomes a royal knight. The friends ran ahead, warning the boss that they would enter the old cabin first. Taking advantage of the moment alone, Elric hands a small, mysterious bag to the young woman. Tyria holds the gift very delicately with her small white gloves. The little girl stares at the bag, confused, wondering what exactly was inside it. Blushing, the boy says that a doctor needs to know about plants and suggests that she plant that afterwards. Currently, young Marie excitedly asks if her boss really tried to plant the gift. Tyria smiles beautifully, revealing that the lovely blue roses in the garden grew from those ancient seeds. The maid jumps in her chair, enamored, praising the lord of the estate's absolute romanticism. The lively atmosphere of the conversation is abruptly interrupted by sharp knocks on the bedroom door. The housekeeper, Rhonda, calls from outside, startling Marie, who realizes she has been there too long. The older woman enters, irritated, scolding the girl for dawdling instead of simply serving the tea. Tyria tries to calm the situation by nervously laughing and taking the blame for trapping the employee there. The housekeeper shows no mercy, not even to her mistress, and strictly orders her to go to bed and rest. Unable to disobey medical orders, the young wife quickly hides under the covers. Satisfied with the obedience, Rhonda bows respectfully and wishes the lady a peaceful night. Outside, the majestic Portman mansion rests peacefully under the starry sky. Inside her luxurious room, the beautiful noblewoman falls into a deep and very serene sleep. The story returns once more to the old wooden cabin illuminated by the strong sun of the past. The 4 children rest scattered across the wooden floor, taking a long afternoon nap. Tyria slowly opens her beautiful eyes, gently awakening from her rest amidst the boys. The girl sits in silence and observes the sleeping face of young Elric beside her. The boy sleeps soundly, grateful for the fun day as he murmurs in his sleep. The little girl smiled lovingly at him, revealing in her thoughts that she had already made her final decision. With great tenderness, she kisses the sleeping boy's face, vowing that she will become his bride in the future. Time passes, and the morning dawns radiantly, illuminating the grand facade of the property in the present. Tyria wakes up refreshed and stretches her body, sitting on her bed with a sweet and loving smile. Young Tyria walks calmly towards the large doors of her room. She grips the golden doorknob tightly to open the door. The girl lets out a little squeal of surprise when she sees her husband standing there. Elric flashes a gentle smile and wishes his beloved wife a good day. With a relaxed demeanor, the young man invites her to have morning tea together. The girl is very happy with the invitation, but remembers she was still in her nightgown. The lord bursts into laughter and politely asks her to get dressed first. With flushed cheeks, the young noblewoman confesses that she had a request to make. Burning with embarrassment, she asks if from that day forward he would call her his wife. The warrior puts his hand to his head, completely surprised and embarrassed by the request. With a loving smile, the young man agrees and immediately calls her his wife. The young woman clasps her hands together and breaks into a radiant smile of pure happiness at the response. Sometime later, 2 beautiful cups of steaming tea are served at the table. The couple chats in the living room while the young woman reads the latest news in the newspaper. Tyria is astonished and comments that the kingdom of Chebor ended up surrendering to the empire. The boy covered his mouth in shock as he remembered that this was the kingdom he was defending. Intrigued by the territory's decline, the lord quickly approaches to read the leaf. The sword demon takes on a serious expression as he reads about the defeat of his former nation. The girl is startled and jumps slightly when she notices her husband's sudden proximity. Elric quickly steps back, apologizing for intruding on her space, but she says it's all right. The 2 exchange sideways glances, their faces completely red with embarrassment. The beautiful lady of the house displays a charming little smile on her lips. The mercenary turns his face away, sweating profusely and struggling to overcome his extreme shyness. Tyria looked up, noticing how nervous her beloved warrior had become. Finding that gesture adorable, she flashes another beautiful, loving smile. The couple remained seated in a tense and very awkward silence on the living room sofa. In a swift movement, Elric gathers his courage and kisses the girl's cheek tenderly. Suddenly, Marie bursts through the door, shouting and announcing an invitation to the royal banquet. The fright causes Elric to chug the teapot into his mouth, while Tyria hides behind the newspaper. The maid holds the letter, completely bewildered by her employer's bizarre reaction.